Yes, we can.
Thank you, thank you.
You can do what you need to do.
Thank you. How do I use another account? Okay.
And we'll just want to log you out afterwards.
Yes. So, how was I supposed to, is this?
I'm not sure. It might have
Okay.
just been Haley misplaced it. She's managing so many different things.
I'm sure. I was like, do I just send these to her? So I sent her like the session number and everything with each talk. But, verify me.
We have Clarissa's. We definitely have Clarissa. Oh, wait. Yep. Yeah, we have hers. And then you have Susie.
Yeah.
Let me go ask her.
Yeah, we'll want to get that.
She said she put it on the main desktop.
Okay.
On this? Oh, okay. That must be. Okay. Yeah, we should be all set then. For that one. So that should be everything.
So I sent the PDF. Is that okay?
Oh.
She requested it in PDF or PowerPoint.
Oh, I think we would want it in PowerPoint. But if that's what you got, that's what we should go with.
Okay.
We'll just wing it.
Okay.
But we'll want to move it onto the desktop.
Yeah. So I downloaded it. But
Can you minimize? Let's see.
is that okay?
We're an organization that helps groups make decisions by consensus, as you might have guessed, from Monday. And I also help manage a network of people who focus on the question of manage and retreat, called the Climate Migration Network. And through that work, we try to help think about how to incentivize basically community-led relocation. And so I'm really glad to be here. I feel honored to lead this session with these incredible presenters today. The all-women panel, folks. So nothing wrong with women. And Nathan. Forgive me for not knowing, but Nathan, represent. So we're going to go in the order that is in the program. I'm just going to say the order so that you have it, and please do the presenters, I'm sure, will say a bit about themselves and also their project. I have to fully disclose that my notes for leading this meeting are just left in the room I came from, which is across the street. So I'm winging it a tiny bit here. But we're going to go in this order. So Virginia, Hanusik. Thank you so much. With Metropolis magazine, we'll go first. After Virginia, we'll go to Susie. And then we'll go to Kristin, Marcell, and Nathan. And then we'll go to Clarisa, Diaz, and Spence. We'll go in that order. Everyone will have time to present, and then we'll save all questions until after we've gone through all of the presentations. And then we will do a few questions up here with the panel, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to ask questions. Okay? So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Virginia.
Watch the time. All right. Can everyone hear me? I'm sorry, I'm very short. I'm wearing clogs today to boost myself. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a true honor. I'm very nervous. I am a photographer. My work focuses primarily on landscapes impacted by climate change. And I'm going to be talking a bit today about a project that I've been working on for the past several years that is focusing on South Louisiana and the architecture, infrastructure, and landscape of the region. I think that it would be safe to say that most of you have seen a lot of maps and graphs this morning, so this will be a slight change in visuals for you. So just quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project started, kind of my process as a photographer engaging with the communities that I've been working with in South Louisiana and kind of the dissemination of the project. And I'll also talk a little bit about what I'm currently working on, and we don't have to leave room for a Q&A because there will be one after. Okay, so disregard number 4. So how this project started, I don't think that this is news to anyone that Louisiana floods a lot. It's actually one of the most, if not the most flood-prone state in the country. You have coastal, fluvial, and pluvial, so coming from the coast, coming from rivers, and then coming from very intense rainfall that happens in the region. On top of that, the state is also experiencing a very severe land loss crisis. So according to the CPRA, more than 1,900 square miles have been lost since 1930, and it's projected that an additional 4,100 square miles will be lost over the next 50 years. If you work in the climate space in Louisiana, which I used to do, I'm now in New York, but you'll see these maps a lot. The projections have changed drastically over the past 5 years that I've been working in this field. So these are typically kind of the visuals that you see. And what's currently underway to save the coast is the Coastal Master Plan, which the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority is responsible for developing. It's a 50-year plan, $50 billion, with projects that range from levee improvements to sediment diversions, literally changing the direction of the Mississippi River. And when the media is talking about these types of projects, you'll typically see these maps or photographs like, or actually let me go back to this. You'll see these maps and very in-depth reporting about the implications of these projects, but the visuals themselves are a little bit difficult to wrap your head around immediately as a viewer. So on the topic of media coverage, when we're talking about climate change, generally the media pays attention to flooding and hurricanes. This is an example from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the floods of 2016 outside of Baton Rouge and the surrounding area. And this was actually a couple weeks ago with the heavy rainfall with the Mississippi River right against the levee in Baton Rouge. So you can see kind of the high level of the river there. Very dramatic, very alarming. And these images certainly are important. But as a photographer, I've asked myself, thinking visually, what really motivates people to act in this space? It's a deeply emotional concept, climate change. And with images like the 3 that you see here, certainly I pulled the most dramatic ones. This is not representative of everything that is in the media, but you'll see that they focus a lot on disaster and aerial photography, which I've seen to kind of dominate the database of visuals when we talk about climate change. There's also an element of dissociation that I would argue is present in these photographs because people are able to look at them, be alarmed, but at the end of the day, say that this isn't happening in my community, so it is what it is. That's not everyone. I just want to say that. But in general, the truth is that no single image can really capture climate change because of the complexity of the issue. So in my own practice with this project, I started looking at the history of building practices in South Louisiana, loosely from the flood of 1927 until the present day, focusing on the architecture of the region because of its ability to show us a comparison across communities, how certain regions, towns are living on the water. It's a landscape that is very volatile and vulnerable to climate change, and it's been described actually as being on the front line of climate change in various contexts. So to me, I was really interested in seeing kind of what the structural response has been on the ground knowing the projects that are currently underway in the state to maintain and save the coast, but what does it look like in the day-to-day landscape? Some inspiration from this project. I'm sure that this has been talked about in other panels and or will be today, but Petrochemical America that came out several years ago with Kate Orff and Richard Misrock as just an example of the blending of art and science and being able to really engage multiple audiences. So being from the fine art field, Richard Misrock, his work on Cancer Alley, which is the strip between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, some of his photographs of the refineries and the communities that are right up against, as you'll see in this photograph, some of those refineries, what that landscape looks like, really getting a sense of place, and then combining that with the drawings and mapping that Kate Orff did to really explain the history and context of the region and the impact that the petrochemical industry has had there. I also pulled from one of my favorite photographers, Joel Sternfeld, his pivotal project called American Prospects that was published in 1987 during the Reagan era, which was essentially a massive national survey of a moment in time in which he really looked at the landscape throughout the country, taking these photographs that are very somber and critical at times, but as a whole survey, it really is a project that if you're looking at it as someone 50 years from now and getting a sense of kind of what that place looked like, getting a feeling for those landscapes that he photographed. So my goal for this project was really to create a new visual story of the landscape of South Louisiana during this pivotal moment of change that's happening. Again, just to reference the massive coastal master plan that's happening, those are all very vague concepts to people outside of the engineering and the climate space. So for me, as I'm photographing these spaces, thinking about the interaction between land and water with structures and water, kind of taking a temperature check of where the region currently is and being able to create a survey and communicate the symbolism that's in the environment there. So you can see the differences across different communities and different socioeconomic levels when it comes to adaptation. And I hesitate saying adaptation because it's not necessarily something that is mandated in these communities. You'll see this is in Holy Cross, New Orleans, which where I'm standing, I'm actually standing on the levee of the Mississippi River. So this structure here is just one within blocks that is actually elevating itself slightly. By no means is it something that would protect the structure from a massive flood, but you'll see that that new development is underway, and it's in stark contrast to the house right next to it, which is a slab on grade. And this type of difference I've seen in the past several years photographing in the region is that it is not, how do I say this? People with the means necessarily to elevate their homes are doing so, and there's a stark contrast as you go from community to community in what that looks like structurally. I get a lot of my shots on a kayak. It's not mine, it's my friend's, and I owe a lot of this work to him. So a lot of my photographs, I'm trying to balance the visual playing field here with the images that have mostly come out of South Louisiana that have been very alarming and dramatic, with more romantic and somber yet deeply emotional images that I think in my own practice I'm trying to really engage people with the sense of place. And I'll just go through quickly a couple more of these. So a little bit just on the dissemination of the work itself. I am a strong believer in using art in academia, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to present on this here. It's important for me to engage people who aren't necessarily in the climate space and thinking about ways to do that. That's why I think that this panel is so important in terms of public engagement, because so much great thinking can be done in these small rooms, but in terms of getting the work done on the ground, what are the steps to doing that and getting people involved in these issues? This is a more infrastructure type photograph of a flood wall in St. Bernard Parish. And then this is the Orleans Avenue Canal in New Orleans. So this project is related to just this national project that I'm working on currently, which is a larger survey of adaptation that's happening in the coast and what it really means to live along the water at this moment. So I'm looking both at the structural components, which are architecture, recreational, how we're using the water, how people are interacting with it, and then land use itself, so kind of combining people, architecture, and then land. Nothing new there, but thinking more critically about what this moment in time currently means for communities that live along the water, what communities are changing faster than others, and so on. So thank you so much. I know that was kind of rushed, but this project is definitely ongoing, and you can find more on my website and social media. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, so many of you have shown up. This is amazing. Great. So I'm going to pick up on Ginny's comment about the emotional content of climate change and how we might need to take that into account in ways we haven't thought about before. So I'm going to speak about our broken hearts and burnout, something that came out with lots of Robin's comments earlier and yesterday evening, too. Let me just get you into it by science. Oh, my God. So we know from the most recent assessment that pretty much everything that causes trauma will increase, right? More heat extremes, more precip events, more severe hurricanes, extended dry periods, wildfires, sea level rise going up. Nothing new to you. It's also pretty well established that these have significant health consequences, including, I'm just going to point those out, some that have significant impacts on people's mental health. So with severe weather, I just mentioned the word trauma. Many people, and it's documented many times, experience post-traumatic stress disorders. We also know from even just some of the conversations that happened so far, when you're forced to migrate, you don't do so well after that, or even when you're faced with that. And then even related to heat, many of you know when things get really hot, we get kind of nasty with each other, really grumpy. So we also know after, so this is, very well established. And what we also know is that there are secondary impacts to them. So for example, after severe storms, PTSD goes up, substance abuse, physical, sexual abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse. And I guess what that portends for the future is that we're going to have an increasing number of adverse, not just childhood experiences. ACEs is something that's become very common in the psychological literature, but really for all of us. We're going to have all of us the experience of adverse experiences with long-lasting effects. We also know that there are all these compounding factors that make these things worse for some of the most, the least privileged, the most neglected, for all the historical reasons we already heard. Now, what I want you to do in the next couple of slides is to imagine, here, this is just a list of what happened after Hurricane Maria, what kind of mental support issues or mental health issues came up and what made people feel very unwell, not just the physical direct effects of them and the lives that we lost, but the stresses, the emotional stresses that come with this. And when I show you this picture, I want you to imagine to be the social worker, the psychologist, the FEMA person on the other end of the table, right? You have thousands of people coming through, hundreds of these every day that you need to deal with. Here's a good picture of that, helping all these distressed people who don't come to you necessarily smiling and being very happy with you. They're like at the edge of their seats, and you're going to have to somehow help them figure out that their lives are going to be hopefully okay again, right? That's your task. What's that person going to be like after 3 weeks of this, 16-hour days without sleep? Or imagine you are the extension person who needs to tell their people who live, this is Charleston, South Carolina, I already mentioned it this morning. Sorry for the cutoff, all the formatting here is a little off. But imagine you are the extension person who has to go into a public meeting and educate these people, and all of a sudden you stare into the faces of people getting it, what you just are telling them, that their livelihoods, their homes, values are going to be basically worthless. Or you're the scientist who is basically shot down for the messages that he gives. What will happen to you in the lower 48s is already happening to us here in Alaska. It's kind of not a nice message to have to tell anybody, right? But this is the kind of lives of those who work on this and who know the most and who are right in the middle of all these distressful events. They have to deal with that. So this is the world they have to deal with. Constant change, lots of uncertainty, something we so don't like to do as human beings. Surprises left and right, and then you have these increasing frequent traumatic disruptions, and increasingly, especially for when we're talking coastal retreat, we're now faced with actually having to lead communities through transformative change. Anybody want to sign up for that? Right. That's the issue, right? We haven't been trained for this. I'll come back to that. So there is a growing concern, and you see it reflected in the research literature, certainly what comes out of anybody paying attention to first responders, of both the sort of long-term perpetual impacts of climate change and how that is affecting people. You hear a lot about grief and anxiety, solastalgia are new terms that we're coming up with in this arena. You obviously also hear of the growing stress by first responders in particular and by activists. That's where it's recognized, not yet for adaptation professionals. We're seeing these as sort of occupational health risks. There is some literature on that. Mostly it's for outdoor workers, people who are exposed to heat. That's what the literature is, but there is at least some beginning recognition. We know it for these groups, and I don't need to say a heck of a lot about these images, but you can very well imagine what the mental health implications for all of these folks are, whether they're losing their ancestral grounds and the identity attached to that, whether they're being told your property is going to be worthless, or even very severe impacts on the cultural activities that have gone with past climatic conditions that are no longer possible, in some instances with life-threatening consequences. We know that all of these things are going up. The US GCRP did a health assessment specifically and recognized with high confidence that even the adverse health effects on mental health are going up. For climate scientists, there is a little bit of literature, but mostly it's anecdotal in the form, if you haven't seen this, you should go on this. Is this how you feel? Thousands of letters scientists have written about what it's like for them to do the work that they do and to know what they know. I'm not going to go into great detail. This happens to be a quote of my own. I'm part of a documentary movie called Once You Know, which is all about how scientists who are deeply in the know, how they process what they know and how they deal with that. This is from my colleague Kristin Goodrich, who is a co-author on this paper. She works with Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve and works with coastal communities on all kinds of educational and capacity building efforts. And for her too, every rainfall is now becoming sort of like, oh my God, what is it like when I come to the office tomorrow morning? I'll show you one more, which is from an email exchange that I recently had with an extension specialist. We actually discovered this article in the LA Times about the growing suicidality rate among first responders, among firefighters in particular, nationwide. So we started this little game where, I'm sorry about the way this is now all arranged, but the line in the article said, when people call 911, they want someone there who's going to be brave and heroic and handle a situation. That was the original quote. And we replaced that. What is that like for an extension specialist? When people call Sea Grant, they want someone there who's going to be clear-eyed and objective and handle a situation. Same thing, right? Or it's chronic, repeated exposure to everyone's worst day. That was the original quote. And then it's chronic, repeated exposure to everyone's raw and unfiltered existential dread. That's the work she goes in to do every day. So the question really is, how can we support the people who know what it's like to know what climate change is coming, who have to go into communities and support them? What kind of support do they need, right? It's very important because they're the ones we're all expecting to be there when, excuse my French, but when the shit hits the fan. We want them to be there to support us. How do we take care of them? As I mentioned, they haven't been trained. You don't learn that in planning school or engineering school or, and whatever. You pick your thing. This is not something that people are already dealing with. Maybe they should. Well, I'm involved in a study, which I want to just show you some preliminary data on, of adaptation professionals, so people just like that, people from urban sustainability directors, Sea Grant, and others. I'll show you more about that in a moment. Who we actually ask them, are you burnt out? Are you, overwhelmed by the work that you do? And 80% said yes, 9% said no, 11 weren't quite so sure. You might say, well, how's that compared to the rest of the country? Well, the rest of the country, the Gallup poll just recently completed a study that looked at how much of a burnout crisis is there in the U.S. And 23 of employees felt burnout very often or always, and 44 feel burned out sometimes. So they ask it slightly differently, but if you add that up, that's 67%. Among these adaptation professionals, it's 80. 8 out of 10 people are fried. They want to leave. In fact, for this project, I have 20 support letters from people who, among some of them who wrote to me, people in my office have left. They don't want to deal with climate change anymore. It's pretty problematic. These are the ones who know the most about climate change. Why? What's going on? So this person is a writing question, and we just basically ask them, so describe to me, what is it that makes your life so hard? It's that they don't feel like they're doing enough fast enough. It's hard, especially for many of them, white professionals, privileged, to work in an environment where very much, we have said this many times in this conference already, where race is centered, where these integration of many different challenges, ongoing stressors comes together with the more occasional shocks, and basically on top of that, it's not just the barriers of bureaucracy, as this person said, but some of others have said, well, just look around. It's also Trump, and it's also whatever. It's these multiple factors, right, that just make your life that much harder. Where does it show up? One of the things I want to simply point out, it shows up for 100% of the respondents on outreach and communication, right, in the engagement with the communities they deal with. So they need it for themselves, and they need to deal with people who are super distressed by what's happening. Again, we haven't trained them. We ask them, how often do you feel things? This is actually a really complicated but also interesting slide. We asked about their emotional experience of working on climate change specifically. I'm emotionally exhausted. Yep, well, some of them feel that at least monthly. The work I do is not enough to address climate change. They feel that almost every day. And yet, they're super committed to actually keep going. So it's a group that's passionate about wanting to do the right thing, but they're actually having a really hard time emotionally with dealing with it. You might ask them then, so are they getting any support? And I don't have time to go into this in great detail. It's a study from my colleague, Missy Stoltz and Sarah Miro, who looked at what professional societies are doing. The quick answer is none of them are supporting their members on the emotional side, the psychosocial support for what they need to do. There are 2 adaptation-specific or climate action-specific professional societies. The only one that actually deals with that is the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Emily Wasley, Jake Pollack, and myself are leading something. It's a member-driven affinity group on personal resilience that basically is there to support adaptation professionals in their work. One quick last thing I want to mention to you is that I'm working on this project where the research I showed you of is part of. We want to actually better understand and sort of document that there is a problem and then work with the professionals as to what is it that would be actually helpful to you. So, you know, I'm going to skip that, what we mean by the adaptive mind, but it is essentially that you can deal with constant change, traumatic change, and transformative change in a short and, whoa, sorry. All this looks different. We've already been starting in just getting a sense with the practitioner landscape and the literature of what's going on there. We want to bring that together in a transdisciplinary expert workshop to identify what of the adaptive mind is actually trainable. You know, is it just because you were born that way? Or is there stuff that we can actually do to build our resilience and strength to do that? And then do trainings, development pilots, and build support networks among those communities that we work with, and institutional support, which I'm happy to talk more of. This is not self-evident that dealing with that in science-oriented organizations is something that people want to deal with. Here are our partners, National Estrogen Research Reserve System, Sea Grant, American Society of Adaptation Professionals, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, Institute for Sustainable Communities, and hopefully also the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, which is an emerging grassroots leaders network for people who work on that in low income and communities of colors. This is the team that's working on it with all the partners from these networks, but also people who are experts in science policy, practice engagement, in training, and in psychology of various sorts. The important thing is that we want to develop resources that actually support people, not just essentially do stuff that, you know, is a one size, who said that yesterday, the cookie cutter thingy, you know. It needs to work for communities of many different backgrounds, and so we're trying to develop practices, resources that people can draw on and bring into their community. So with that, I'll leave it there and pass it back on to you. Thank you.
I am. It doesn't look like it's going very well. All right, so the cursor.
So this is sort of coming in and out. So point it a little more.
That sounded good. All right, it's working. All right, so raise your hand if you can't hear me. That's a test. So I'm Kristin Marcell. I'm with Cornell University Water Resources Institute and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Hudson River Estuary Program. I'm here with Nathan Mitchell, who's the chair of the Piermont Waterfront Resilience Commission, and we're going to share with you a little bit about what's been happening in Piermont. The first thing I want to do is recognize Bennett Brooks, who has been the lead on this. He's a colleague of Carri's at the Consensus Building Institute. And I want to recognize our funder, the American Arbitration Association, which funds challenging conversations. And that's part of what we're doing in Piermont, trying to come to some consensus on ways forward in different neighborhoods in Piermont. We're also working with Scenic Hudson, a large nonprofit in the Hudson Valley, and Neckerman Consulting. And I'm going to hand it off to Nathan, who's going to tell us a little bit about Piermont.
All right, so a little bit about who Piermont is and where Piermont is and what Piermont is we're a really tiny community. We're less than 1 square mile, and we have about 2,500 residents. The median age of our population is 51, which is a little bit above the average for New York State, and our median income is $101,000 a year, which is, again, a bit above average for New York State. And our median home value in the town is $635K, which is more than twice what the average is for the entire state. So more than 78% of our residents have education beyond high school, but their homes are most residents' biggest financial asset. And we have strong traditions of volunteerism and community participation in Piermont. We have all-volunteer fire department and EMS department. We also have a volunteer Piermont Civic Association and Historical Society, and our library is largely supported by volunteers as well. So since Sandy, we've gotten really good, strong engagement out of the community on issues about climate change and sea level rise, and we've been able to establish the Piermont Waterfront Resiliency Commission. We also are participating in New York State's Climate Smart Communities program, and we've created an initiative called Sustainable Piermont, where we're pursuing activities that we can do in the community to reduce our carbon footprint. So one of the things that we've done that was kind of ahead of the time for the county is we instituted last year a ban on single-use plastic bags in the village, and a few months later the county actually followed suit with that and banned them across the county. So we like to think of ourselves as leaders that way. And we also have recently installed an EV charging station and are putting in all LED street lights in town. But the simple fact of the matter is that the Rockland County Hazard Mitigation Plan identified 52.5% of the village of Piermont as being at risk of a 1% flood. That's the highest of any community in the county. So we're uniquely positioned in that way. And now, forward. Okay. So some of the things that are challenging for us, which are also things that have always made the community unique and excellent in a lot of regards, is we have the Sparkill Creek, which is a tidal creek running right through the middle of town. That does present some complications in terms of various mitigation options that might be available to us, because we can't block off the creek and it'll back up in any kind of a seawall situation. We also have large portions of the village, about 52.5%, are less than 7 feet NAVD 88, and our average tide at high tide is between 3 and 3.5 feet. So we're not very far off of having high tide just come across the whole village. We also are on a steep hillside, so we have flooding concerns that aren't simply sea level rise flooding concerns. There's also a great amount of upland flooding concern, and that also makes it challenging in terms of relocating to higher ground, because we have limitations on how densely you can build on a steep slope that we put into place in response to steep slope flooding issues we encountered in the last couple of decades. So one of the things that's interesting in Piermont is that we have this conflict going on right now between, there's always been a premium for real estate that was on the waterfront. But now we're in a situation where that same waterfront real estate that people have paid a premium for has a threat to it and costs associated with flood insurance that weren't issues in the past. And it's kind of changing the dynamic of real estate in the community overall. So our population density and the scarcity of undeveloped land are our major challenges to manage retreat, but managed retreat also seems to be our best option in a lot of cases. So on the bright side of things, we do have our own Department of Public Works, our own police department, our own fire department and EMS, and we have the Waterfront Resiliency Commission, and we've just updated our local waterfront rebuilding plan. What is that? Revitalization plan, yes, thank you. And we've updated our building codes after Sandy to tailor them to flood risk areas needing to have all new construction and all substantial improvements come up to new code. So those are to our benefit, and our village government is committed to attacking these issues on all fronts. We have an engaged population that's participating in educational and volunteer opportunities, and we also have had really fantastic support from Kristin and from Bennett and from all the organizations that we've worked with on this program and several other programs that we continue to work with. And with that, I'll hand it back off to Kristin.
Thank you, Nathan. So I wish that I could put everything on the list that Piermont has done since we began working with them back in 2013, 2014. It's a very long list. They've been a very dedicated partner. But I think one of the things that we've started to realize is that even with this really robust partnership, the questions in Piermont are so complex and the area to work in so constrained that there's still not necessarily a clear vision for which neighborhood is going to do what, and what is the community as a whole going to do. So we're, in this project, trying to address some of those barriers by taking some new approaches from a very personal level, from the ground level. So one of the first things that I think struck us about this, and we've been working with the Waterfront Resilience Commission hand in hand for this entire process, is that the community members are not going to be able to get behind what they want to do, what they think should happen in their neighborhood, or what should happen as a community if they haven't first figured out what they're going to do individually as a homeowner or a property owner or a renter about their own situation. So we're trying to tackle that. We think it's much more compelling to have neighbors speak with neighbors about this situation. If you think about any kind of, dicey situation you might be struggling with on a personal level, you want to talk to other people about it. You don't necessarily want to hear somebody come in from the state and be like, oh, this is what you should do. So it's really more important that we develop these personal relationships among the residents of Piermont to carry out these conversations. We need to get the risk information down to a very fine scale, high resolution, individual structure level for the community members to think about their personal adaptation options. And we need to really dig into the emotional and personal considerations that are just as important as the practical considerations when you're thinking about, your long-term future. The other thing we've done, and I think this started from the very beginning when we started resilience planning with Piermont, is organizing the community into neighborhoods where there are similarities in risk. And what's new about this project is that we're inviting members, and Nathan and Lisa DeFisiani, who works very closely with Nathan on the commission, reached out to get neighborhood leaders or liaisons who will be representing each one of these neighborhoods that is at risk and volunteering to go through this process with us and co-design this process with us and then bring this information to their neighbors in the community. So this is a picture of Nava from Scenic Hudson, and she's sharing some of this risk information that we're trying to tailor to the individual homeowner scale. We're very lucky to have Columbia University and the Stevens Institute of Technology have developed some very high-resolution information where you can change the sea level rise scenario, you can change the flood frequency, and you can see the depth of water that might be, if you subtract it using our high-resolution elevation data, you can see the depth of water that might be on any individual property. So we're using that to tailor this personal risk information. We are tailoring information on the adaptation options, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We've been working on new tools for guiding folks through the emotional process and thinking process. Really focusing on building relationships within the residents of Piermont and among the liaisons that are going to be leading this effort for their neighborhoods. Co-learning with Piermont. This is something that we have to be learning from them as much as they're learning from us in this process because it's all new ground. And we're trying to get as grassroots as we can get. So this is the village of Piermont from an aerial view. And the top of the picture there is north. Anywhere that's in a darker red is area that's higher risk of flooding. And so this is, again, using these tools from Columbia University and our high-resolution elevation data. Scenic Hudson was able to create some maps for us that turned out to be immensely valuable. So what we decided to do in terms of the flood depth information was to focus on numbers that were easy to wrap your mind around, 6 inches, a foot and a half, rather than using the exact projections that might be in the state or NOAA projections, and then trying to correlate that with time steps that generally correlate with the medium sea level rise projection for the state and for NOAA. And so that's where we end up here with, you can see the time steps up over my head in the Piermont region. And then the other thing we did was try to look at nuisance flooding, sunny day flooding, and use that information to give residents a perspective on how often their area is going to be flooded without a storm. And so these numbers are pretty compelling. And this is just the medium scenario. You're looking at 100 days by 2040. So very dramatic change. Then we turn that into tables that an individual can have the water depths for the 5-year storm, the 20-year storm, the sunny day flooding, the 100-year storm, for their property. And then they can go through a set of questions to start to think about, is my basement affected? Is my first floor affected? Is my yard affected? Is my street affected? And are there other services that come into my home that are also going to be affected at that water depth based on what I know and my history living here in Piermont? Neckerman Consulting then used, Bill Neckerman is a wealth of information on the floodplain management programming at the state level and at FEMA. And he created this tool, which is basically taking the different adaptation options that you might have available to you as a homeowner or as a community, and then looking across the table at the top, you can see some very important questions that a homeowner would want to know. What's the level of protection for this? What is the relative cost for this? Is this something I can do on my own, or do I need to have the government working with me on this? Do I need permits? Is government help available? What are the adverse impacts? Am I going to be negatively affecting my neighbor if I take one of these options? How long am I going to be protected? And most importantly, is this going to affect my flood insurance rates? And so once we got through some of these tools with the neighborhood liaisons, that we found that they were very, very interested in knowing more. Like, where are the contractors? Do you guys have a list of contractors? Where are the financial planners? Who can come and talk to me about what I can afford to do on my property? So it made a really big difference in their motivation. The next big piece is the personal and emotional side. So the Consensus Building Institute and myself, and with Nathan and Lisa's help, we basically took one of those example properties and we created a fictional story to go along with that property. And then we shared that story and the risk profile with these neighborhood leaders and asked them to consider, because sometimes it's easier to consider someone else's situation before you've considered your own. What would you do if you were in the shoes of this homeowner and this family and the situations that they have, the needs of their family, their personal financial situation? And so that really started to get the wheels turning in everyone's brain. And there was a lot of, there were some very opinionated responses about what this hypothetical family should do. They didn't always agree, but that's okay. We recognize that's going to be a reality. But it really got people to, it's once you go through a process like that, then you start to internalize some of those issues yourself. And then the next piece is a personal risk questionnaire that we have been working with the Piermont liaisons on, that asks a series of questions similar to what you might experience if you were going in to see a retirement planner. What are your personal goals in life? What's most important to you about where you live? What's most important to your family's needs? How important is schools, healthcare? Do you need to live by the water? Could you imagine going through another Hurricane Sandy? These are the kinds of questions that they would then take home with them, fill out either on their own or with their family, and come back to the next meeting having gone through some kind of an internalization and a thought, hopefully an enriching process of understanding what their own personal goals are and how they might align with their future. And then the Consensus Building Institute Bennett running a training also for these neighborhood leaders so that they can start to learn what's most important when you're leading a discussion with a group of people who may be going through grief, may be scared, may be afraid to think about these things. And so the Consensus Building Institute, they're some of the best facilitators and mediators out there. So they're having the opportunity to learn from some of the best on that. And that's going to translate then into them leading conversations on their own with their neighbors. So this project is about halfway through. The next step will be taking the tools we built with the neighborhood liaisons and bringing these out to larger workshops with all the residents. Some of the things that we've learned about early on are in kind of using this model are that the liaisons were very concerned about their own personal liability. If they were going to be taking this information out to other residents, were people going to be looking to them for advice, and what would that mean for them? So we've had to be very clear about the role that these liaisons are playing in facilitating dialogue and starting the conversation, being a conduit for new information, but not advising at all on what individual homeowners should do. Another clear thing we learned is using the higher frequency storm scenarios and the nearer term sea level rise projections was much more compelling than thinking out, what is the 500-year storm going to look like here in Piermont? I think that's pretty obvious to all of us that that's the kind of decision making. We need that nearer term information for decision making. These tools that we've created to have people think through the personal risk information in these hypothetical family scenarios, very engaging, really got gears turning. There were moments of silence where you could just feel some of the weight of these questions sinking in to the residents, these leaders, as they were realizing that they were going to have to try to share this information with their neighbors going forward. And that gets to the last point, which is trying to make these meetings feel as personal and relaxing and intimate as possible. Having meetings in people's living rooms, always making sure that there's food. It's really important for these very challenging emotional conversations. And so, as someone who works in state government, I will say we don't often recognize the value of food in meetings like this. Really, really important to have food. And if you can swing it, some wine's good too. But the food is tremendously important. So that's my contact information. Nathan, anything you would want to add?
I think that's got it.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Want to do this full screen here. I control it. Sorry. Sorry, I'm not really familiar so much with the PowerPoint. So it's view. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not a mouse. Got it.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Clarisa Diaz, and I am a designer and a reporter for WNYC, that's New York Public Radio. My background is actually all in professional design, so I started in architecture and have gone into interaction, graphics, and service design. So a lot of my stories come from this kind of design lens, and then sometimes also extend out of the stories into engagement projects that are related to the people that we're telling the stories about. So I'm just going to go over a couple of projects that I've done. One is for the Sandy anniversary, the 5-year anniversary, and I focused on Midland Beach, which is a community on Staten Island. So the red lines there are what was predicted for a Category 1 hurricane. But kind of what actually happened, there was a lot, Sandy was not at the time classified as a Category 1 hurricane. It was like right below that. But the flooding, the damage actually, in some places exceeded where it was predicted. You can see now that the evacuation zone maps have been updated. So the Zone A, immediate zone for evacuation in 2012 when Sandy happened, has significantly expanded to now, just a year after. So what usually happens, I mean, this story focused on, what are the communication systems that we have to know about the threat and the risks of oncoming storms? Because during Sandy, a lot of people didn't even know what storm surge was, and it was, it kind of caught people by surprise. And really, a lot of what we get these like mobile alerts. It's just this like text thing, and it tells you if you want to know more to check local media, but it doesn't really give you a lot of information. And so this is kind of like a systems map looking at like what are the different ways that an oncoming storm or severe storm or hurricane is coming. How does that action decision happen, and how does that get to the residents? So the top there is the National Hurricane Center with the National Weather Service talking to the New York City Office of Emergency Management. They have kind of two streams of communication. One is public messaging, A lot of that is through digital devices, so they'll have press conferences with the media, but then they'll be relying on the radio, TV, online websites. They have Notify NYC, which is kind of an automatic alert system to your phone, similar to the slide I showed previously. And then they have kind of external affairs, human services, CERT team, which is a volunteer group of people who are trained in emergency response. And there are several maybe nonprofit or community organizations that they might network with to share their messaging about an oncoming storm. And these other groups here, VOAD and Citizen Corps. So this is Roseanne. She's one of the residents of Midland Beach that I interviewed, and she kind of summed it up pretty well. She's like, the more you watch the news, the more panic you feel they create. You don't know whether to heed the warnings, not heed the warnings. Is it too late to heed the warnings? We thought at most there would be a foot or two of water. We've lived in this house for 40 years. We had only gotten a little bit of water in the basement, so we didn't evacuate like we probably should have. Also, previous to this, Hurricane Irene had happened, and a lot of people viewed that as a false alarm because it wasn't as bad as it was predicted to be. So we had, well, at least in New York City, it did cause a lot of damage upstate. We had only gotten a little bit of water in the basement until we saw the water rushing down the street from the beach. We didn't realize how much trouble we were in. Right. So this kind of gets to like, who do you trust when it comes time to evacuate? Midland Beach, it had the most deaths in the city. In terms of neighborhood, 11 people died in this neighborhood, and a lot of that was because of the topography of the land kind of created this bowl, so the water kind of just flooded it. In doing this story, as a designer, as a journalist, you might think like, okay, I've done all these interviews with all these people. I interviewed climate scientists at IRI, Andrew Kruczkiewicz, designers at IDEO, Parsons, local nonprofit groups, the Staten Island Long-Term Recovery Organization, and residents. And so you kind of, the output for that as a journalist is the story, but as a designer, it's like, these are like stakeholders that I've now interviewed all these people, and they all have a perspective that, why can't we actually just bring all these people together to talk about this stuff? Because it kind of turned out that like on the ground, the communication of storm risk was not really being communicated. It was kind of more top-down. So we came up with the idea. We had several meetings with all the people that were interviewed for the story to, come up with what's a kind of like a workshop or something that we can do to have more of a conversation in Midland Beach. This was it was part art installation, part co-design workshop. So this first part here, this is like there was a community center that we were going to hold the event, and so we looked at where the zone boundaries were. Evacuation zone boundaries that were around that center, and we decided to create kind of this public art stencil project, and that would go along these lines so that it would inform people what evacuation zone they're in, but it would also give them resources and ask questions to get them thinking prior to the co-design workshop. So like, how can you help out in an emergency? Know your zone, they can look up where their zone is, and this was the newsroom. turned my desk into like a design studio in the newsroom. So these are some of the laser cut stencils that we created. And then we worked with the Staten Island Long-Term Recovery Organization, which is a local community group there, and we stenciled out all of these stencils around. So these are some examples of some of the zone stencils. So this is Evacuation Zone 1, where to look up where your zone is. And then the second part in the evening was a workshop where we then had residents, people from New York City, Office of Emergency Management, everybody who was like part of that story and their related organizations came together to talk about like these like superpowers that we have as people. So like, and as residents for them to get to know each other. So in terms of superpowers, thinking about like, not that you're going to save everything, but like, we might have these like potential skills that we don't even realize we have that are useful in emergency to help one another in a community. So like this lady, she wrote down that she's a cat lady on the far right, and she's also a retired registered nurse. So in an emergency, she cares about animals, and she understands kind of basic medical care for first aid. And this man is a retired teacher in the neighborhood or in the district, and he thought like what he could offer is critical thinking skills. This lady is a food systems expert, the next lady here, and she said that, she was really good at like managing like resources and like food for the neighborhood if they needed to have a storage place. And my favorite was this lady here who said she's a animal rescuer, and the thing she was most proud of during Sandy was that she rescued a Great Pyrenees. So, it was just like, it was there was a lot of tragedy in this neighborhood, but I think this community was also very resilient in that they know, like, okay, the next storm's going to come, what are we going to do? And so how can we actually then, like, talk to each other, get to know each other, and try to think about, like, what resources do we share? So once people kind of identified their, like, own individual kind of superpowers, then they were put into groups where they could, share what their superpowers were with each other, and then come up with a service that represented, took into account all of their skills. So this was an example of looking at, a lot of reasons why people don't leave is because they don't want to leave their pets behind. So what's a way that this neighborhood could maybe partner with another neighborhood further upland to, take care of animals for the time being while they go to a shelter, this kind of thing. So a lot of these were not like, implemented. I mean, they might be getting more. It might have sparked some ideas to like implement things within the community, but the main purpose of this was just to get everybody to start to know each other, because a lot of people didn't know each other prior to this, and to start talking about these ideas and hopefully, continue their work together. And also because we had our experts that were in the story, people from IDEO and Columbia who were also there, they were able to also provide a lot of expertise to the residents and to like, have a dialogue with them in a way I think that kind of improved everybody and elevated everyone. So the link up there is where the main story is. If you're interested. And we also made a video. Looking at stories in public service journalism as this kind of multi-pronged, multi-platform approach. So you might have something that's online, you're in the field, getting audio, but then you're also trying to engage back with that audience. So this is another recent project looking at snow. And a lot of people don't think about really flooding with snow, but as less snowpack is being held and there more snow is melting, that could potentially create a flooding hazard as well inland. So this project looked at snowflakes. So I worked with Marco Tedesco at Lamont. I went with him and his team in the field and kind of observed how they did their research, and then we worked together to create the story and a citizen science project, which I'll share as the slides go on. So this is a snowflake that has rime on it. So it's basically because the air is warmer, the water's sticking to the snowflake, so it's less able to reflect light. Because it cannot reflect light, it's holding that heat, and so it melts faster. So the idea is like you go from the snowflake and the snowflake melting faster to the snowpack to the idea of, put other hazards to hydrology of the region as well as erosion. So on the right is kind of like how a snowflake would normally form, and on the left would be kind of how it's forming now with warmer temperatures, glomming on to each other because of wind. You get these like mega snowflakes, and how that could affect water resources. So one thing that Marco's team does is they actually have these clip-on microscopes that go on your phone, so you can actually take like microscopic photos of snowflakes, which I thought was visually very interesting, because we're not used to really seeing snowflakes like that. So this was a photo I took when we went up in the Catskills of some snowflakes up there. And then in the end, this year, designed a toolkit, a citizen science toolkit, so that anybody could kind of take these photos and measurements in their own backyard and upload them to a website that we made with Columbia University and share that data back with Marco's team. So this is Patrick. He's one of the senior researchers on Marco's team, and he's using the clip-on microscope there to take photos of snowflakes. So then we, at WNYC, we partnered with Bronx Science, and this was some students up at Bronx Science that were also doing the same method. So we also had a bunch of curriculum that we put together to work with these schools as well. And this is from New York Harbor School and some of the snowflake photos that the students took there. These are actually really nice snowflakes. The one on this side, this one here is a 12.1, which is pretty rare. So you also find like really good stuff too. Yeah, and then at Columbia here, to get everybody prior to all this, before, we worked with the teachers, but before that, we brought all the teachers kind of together at the Earth Institute to do a workshop. And this is an activity building a light box from a shoebox. So if you can't get like that snow card and all that equipment, you can just take a shoebox and put a grid on it. You just need the microscope, and you can do the same thing. You can kind of collect these snowflakes. So there we are with our light boxes. So, yeah. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caitlin Spence. I'm in data services at the Boston, Greater Boston Area Regional Planning Agency, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Can I ask if anyone knows how to present a PDF in presenter mode? Control L? Okay. Yeah, I was hoping to avoid this sort of presenting a PowerPoint on a new computer, but this comes with its own pitfalls. Thank you.
Hopefully it has Acrobat installed. It did. Yeah, this is the same one.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow. Now there's a lot of pressure for this to be great. So, I'm going, oh no, no. Okay, we're okay. So everyone, thanks for having me here, and thank you all so much for your talks. I feel like I've learned so much and wanted to rewrite this talk about every talk I see today. So I'm going to talk about MAPC's work facilitating municipal vulnerability preparedness programs under deep sea level rise uncertainty. So just as an overview of my talk, I'm going to talk about sea level rise in Massachusetts, the data resources we have, the institutional and sort of procedural resources we have, talk about a case study in Hull, Massachusetts, incidentally also a very flood-threatened region in England with the same name, go over the Hull Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Workshop, materials, process, and outcomes, and the priority actions and lessons we learned as an agency conducting the planning process in this area. So just talking about sea level rise on the Massachusetts coast, this is a map showing the 101 municipalities that MAPC serves. We sort of classified these municipalities by community type in our last regional plan update, Metro Future, which we're updating right now. And if you look at the coastline, what you'll see is that there's a really wide range of community types that are exposed to coastal risks that we're serving, from sort of more rural suburbs, affluent communities, working class communities, and really dense urban core metropolitan areas. So we have a challenge that we face when we go to a lot of very different areas and try to help them with planning for climate change solutions that will work in their area and for the specific hazards that they face. The Massachusetts Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs runs a municipal vulnerability preparedness program that makes municipalities and groups of municipalities working together eligible for two types of grants, MVP planning grants and MVP action grants. MVP planning grants are grants that allow, give communities funding to convene committees, stakeholder committees, municipal staff committees to sit down and define the extreme weather and climate hazards they face, understand what impacts their community may face under those hazards, identify their vulnerabilities and strengths, and develop and prioritize actions for the community. After going through one of those planning grants and becoming MVP certified, they can then apply for MVP action grants to actually implement some of the priority actions that they've developed. So to go into the data resources we have, sea level rise is just one of the climate hazards that our communities are facing, but it's the main hazard that I'll be talking about today. So in Northeast, in Massachusetts, we are lucky to have a very long range, long history of tide gauge in the Boston Harbor, and we're able to extrapolate that forward to get an estimate of what the future might be like in terms of sea level. On the other hand, in climate change, we know that the future may not represent the past, and it's important to look into novel mechanisms that can affect the conditions we'll experience and might make these extrapolations invalid. So fortunately, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been repeatedly convening and synthesizing scientific information and scientific evidence. However, when you're working at the municipal scale, this can be very challenging to communicate. One thing you'll see as we move forward in time and as we improve the science and build the scientific evidence is that, one, there's a really broad range of scenarios contingent on just inherent uncertainty in the system, greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, and another thing is that the upper limit of what's possible and the range of future scenarios that are realistic keeps expanding as we learn more, and not necessarily contracting. And that just exacerbates the challenge that we're facing. One thing we like to do when we go to work with communities on climate change preparation is take these sort of abstract lines and colors and try to really contextualize the information to help communities make the best informed decisions we can. Fortunately, in the Boston Harbor area, we have these really detailed storm surge simulations under different sea level rise scenarios that were put together by the Woods Hole Group. These are being expanded this summer to cover the entire Massachusetts coast. When communicating uncertainty, we like to contextualize the storm surge depth maps, storm surge risk maps with the uncertainty in when these sea level rise scenarios that we have these detailed maps for will arrive. And so we've put together this, these figures that show sort of our maps, our sea level rise scenario maps contextualized with a really wide range of projections to try to communicate, here's a scenario that could happen, here's the range of sort of timelines when we now, based on the latest available knowledge, expect it might happen. And the case study I'm going to talk about today, our MVP program with Hull, was the first time we really tried to introduce this rigorous scientific communication of the uncertainty. This is the map of our region with Hull highlighted in dark green. As you see, it's a peninsula. Hull is sort of snuggled against Hingham and Cohasset, which are both more affluent suburbs of Boston. We have a wonderful team of community engagement specialists and designers who put together posters like this for us to bring to our all sorts of plans. This is our MVP social vulnerability poster that we put together for Hull, highlighting the increasing proportion of older adults in the population and the significant proportion of low-income households in the area. We also put together a natural resources poster to try to communicate the natural resources, in this case, coastal beach, salt marsh, the tree canopy, and freshwater resources. Some of the challenges Hull is facing that came up in this meeting is that that we hadn't really brought in as information to communicate. This came out of the workshop participants saying that they have seen just chunks of the salt marsh. Can I point with this? No. Chunks of the salt marsh in that sort of inland elbow of Hull just break off and float away. So they're losing salt marsh. They have, at this point, a small population of fishers in their community, but the fishers have had to shift to new types of catch as the ecological transformation occurs. Even though Hull is on the water and experiences the coastal breeze, it has very little tree canopy. It's pretty developed and hardened in most areas that aren't hills. And so the land surface temperature is very hot, and they may experience heat hazards in the future. In addition, their freshwater resources come from the Ware River watershed in Hingham. I believe it's run by Aquarian. And so there's a concern about getting their water supply and utilities cut off during storms from the mainland. And in addition, because the watershed is so small, there's this concern about contamination and drought as well. I'm going to focus primarily on the risk of storm surge flooding and sea level rise. These are the figures we brought to show what Hull might expect in the future, and contextualize that with when these scenarios might be expected to occur, if ever. So just with 8 inches of sea level rise, the chance of storm surge flooding increases in Hull, even though it does have seawalls on both sides. And it would put a lot of the critical infrastructure underwater under increasingly frequent flooding scenarios. We also were able to show the depth of the storm surge flooding. So the MVP process involves convening a large workshop of local stakeholders, municipal staff, staff from state agencies, community organizations, and naturalist groups, a long list based on collaboration with the municipality and with our MVP trained staff. The priority actions that came out of this planning process were surprisingly practical given the sort of extreme impacts that we were able to show are possible in the coming decades. So there was, the priority actions included making sure vulnerable populations were served as the Hull faces increasing climate stressors, mitigating emissions by developing alternative and clean energy sources that would also reduce their reliance on energy from the mainland, reducing the physical risk of flooding through a combination of ecological restoration and strengthening and elevating existing flood barriers and stormwater infrastructure, and flood-proofing critical infrastructure. So some of the lessons learned, I think, are that we dedicated a lot of time and effort to bringing in the latest available science and trying to contextualize it, really put a lot of thought into communicating deep uncertainty. And I think many of our planners were expecting or had on their minds managed retreat as one of the options that could realistically be discussed in a planning process like this. What we found was a lot of very practical solutions were suggested. They were very tailored toward enduring the frequent flooding that Hull already experiences and how to make Hull more resilient after flooding. The reaction to seeing some of the sea level rise projections and maps were sort of, one quote is, "When will my yard be underwater?" I think a lot of the solutions were tailored to sort of lower end scenarios and less to thinking about what would happen in the eventuality that you do have this Antarctic ice sheet instability and these increasing greenhouse gas concentrations that could lead to really high flood risks and put a lot of Hull underwater, potentially 50% of years. I think one of the lessons we learned as a planning team was that to spur action, an action that responds to sort of the scale of threats that some of our communities are facing, we need more established institutional pathways and just training to starting these conversations in a way that doesn't shut them down, that invites local solutions. And it really, what we need goes beyond just more scientific evidence. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. So as our panelists come up here, why don't you all take a second and just reflect, turn to a person next to you, and think of what was sort of the one key takeaway that you took from these, or the question, or sort of the thing that's sticking with you at the moment. Just have a quick conversation in Diaz, and then we'll get set up here, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
I think we need one of those too. I usually don't attend the planning workshop. I did for this case.
That's fine. That's fine. Then I have another member, if you can say anything about why you're coming, if you didn't talk about it.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think I have a lot to learn.
When you said, you need more training, is that from your side? Training of how to have this conversation?
Absolutely. I think because there's sort of, the MVP process seems to be most successful in communities that are facing sort of minor adaptation challenges. I think, in our discussion at Hull, I think people felt limited by what they thought they had funding to do, and so we got solutions that were sort of within that scope. And I think a lot of people, both from MAPC and from Hull, were afraid to start talking about or to introduce the topic, though there was sort of peripheral discussions happening about when do I sell my house.
Remember that one graph that I showed you where in what place does this climate change and extreme events enter your work, and it 100% was with the community engagement and outreach. Most of what people want so far is some coping skills for themselves, but mostly how do I help my community engage and be at that communication end of things. So it's very much the training for how to do difficult conversations as opposed to or people communicating science, which is what we've done for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
What you're talking about is what we want to do.
Yeah, my background is in water resources engineering and geoscience, so I think I've heard that a lot, but you don't learn this in engineering school or planning school.
That's the most important thing.
All right, thanks, folks. Just wrap up the conversation that you're in, if you would. All right, if you can hear me, just clap once. And if you can hear me, clap twice. And if you can hear me, clap 3 times. Beautiful. Thank you. So I just gave you all a standing ovation. I just want you to notice that. So I'm going to turn to the panelists, ask each of them one question, then we'll turn it over to the audience, and I'm going to come sit by you, Susie. So okay. I'm not standing here. So Susie, I'll start with you because you're just right here next to me. And is this on? Yeah, great. So Susie, I thought it was really fascinating to hear you talk about the trauma and the challenge that people on the practitioner side feel doing this work. And I think that's interesting because I'm sure the question that I had in my mind, a lot of people here, I think, is, well, what about the people who are actually experiencing the flooding and experiencing the wildfire? And I am just curious if you could talk a little bit about what might be different, or maybe what is different, about someone who is both. Someone who's both on the experiencing side and someone who is working as an adaptation professional to try to improve their community and the world.
That's a great question, and you're pointing right to the origin of the project that I introduced you to, the Adaptive Mind project. So it emerged out of the sheer simple observation that many of the coastal practitioners who have to confront their communities live in those communities, right? So as Sandy comes through, as Katrina comes through, they're flooded too. Or think about the more extreme case that we all have become aware of, the little town of Paradise, 26,000 people, burned down completely, and every single council member, including the mayor, lost their houses as well. So while they're faced with the most traumatic, dramatic situation you can imagine, they also don't have a place to go home to, right? That's the situation we're talking about, where they have to do self-care and be more capable than ever, take on more stress than ever to deal with all the people who are distressed more than ever, right? So it comes actually exactly out of that situation. And since then, we've spread the survey to all these different groups that we're working with, and not all of them have gone through that situation. I can't remember if we have a question. Yeah, actually we do have a question in there to ask whether they have experienced and to see are their responses in any way different. I don't know yet. We're still collecting the data and analyzing, but it'll be interesting to see if there's a difference in experience of stress levels and emotional experiences if they have flooded out or not. So don't know yet, but that's where it comes from.
Thank you. Caitlin, I'm interested, I'm directing a question to you to answer first, but this is actually sort of for the whole panel, so at some point you all might talk about this. I'm guessing that folks came to this session because they thought, oh good, I'm going to go hear about how to help people talk about managed retreat. And then virtually in none of the examples were people talking about managed retreat. They were talking about other things, or maybe they were talking about managed retreat as a subset. That question's coming to you in a minute, Kristin. And so there's a question, well, even our best efforts, maybe, they're still falling short. It's still really hard for people to talk about this. And particularly in Hull, where I think you did some really interesting things that you described for us about how people can really engage with these questions of adaptation broadly, and yet you showed us the maps. We saw what that community is facing, and still they wouldn't talk about it. So can you just reflect on why? Why is it so hard?
Yes, thank you for framing that question extremely well. Why is it so hard? I think many people are more experienced with facilitating these conversations than I am, and I think my co-author of this presentation, Ann Herbst, who lived in Hull for 10 years, has long-standing relationships there, and the Conservation Commission before she started working at MAPC, and in many other ways would have a lot more depth to add to this. But I think there's a strong sense of community identity in many places who have faced repeated flooding and natural hazards together. Hull is certainly a place like this. They're experienced facing flooding, and I think they know what they need to do to ameliorate the current sort of state of affairs. And I think it's really hard to imagine the future even if you see the maps. And I think there can be a tendency to just shut down. The title of my talk was 100 More Years, something else. Anyway, that was referencing a news article on Hull's celebrating its 375th anniversary, I believe, and that coming up, and the challenges that Hull has faced in flooding. The high school routinely has early dismissals during king tides. Parts of the peninsula are routinely cut off. Boston deploys duck boats. They're looking into getting their own duck boats. They're not just for tourism. One of the senior officials was saying, we've faced a lot of challenges essentially, but I fully expect Hull to be going strong, celebrating its 475th anniversary in 100 years. So I think there's a real sense of inertia and community identity, and also a tendency to kind of shut down when confronted with scary but uncertain futures.
Yeah, can I just add to this? So I'm certainly guilty of this myself. I've worked on climate communication since the early 2000s, and the problem has always been framed back then for all the legacies of where this field came from, that it's about communicating science, right? We have to figure out how to get these people to understand uncertainty, and you still hear it here. And I think maybe what Andy said earlier this morning, it took him 13 years to discover there's a social scientist to talk to. 18, oh my God, even longer. Yeah, so, even more problematic. That the point is that maybe if we had, spoken to the people on the ground and to social scientists who have much longer experience with this, maybe we would have stopped doing that a lot longer, and we would have actually started with the experience of the people we're talking to, or talking with and not talking to. Even that is an issue. So I think we're not trained in this. We're not literally in communication science, you're potty trained to think about messengers. I don't think the transformation we're talking about is about messengers at all. I would love it if you walked away from here and never, ever tried to figure out your message again. This is coming from a communications expert, right? Like, literally, I'm asking you, don't ever, this is my message to you, do not ever try to figure out your message again, because you need to connect with people. You need to build a relationship. It is not about anything else. And once you have a relationship, you can deal with grief. You can deal with, how do I deal with this? The whole, what we heard from the Consensus Building Institute, in your case New York, in your town, just to kind of how to deal with the emotional side of this. That's where we need to go, and we have not trained people in that score. 100% of people deal with climate change in their communication and engagement side. That is where we need to help people gain skills, and it's not about communicating the science.
Thank you. Anyway, thank you. As I say, Kristin, I think you'll have more to say on that in a moment. Ginny, I was very interested when you started talking about the fact that you are really curious about what motivates people to act and how can you as a photographer actually compel people to action. And I found it so interesting that the choice that you made was to focus on infrastructure. Like I was expecting to see a bunch of images of people, right? People experiencing the challenges, and you choose infrastructure. And I would love for you to talk about how do you see that, those visual images and the way you approach them being something that will motivate people to act?
Yeah, so there's three parts to that. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah. Okay. The first part is that architecture symbolizes values. It's something that you're able to document over time, changing. I think that there is deep meaning and history in how we build and where we choose to build. It really symbolizes something much deeper in terms of priorities and, society. So that's the first part. Second part, I am terrible at portraiture. Anytime that I've ever tried to take a picture of someone, it's been painful for everyone involved. But in a serious way, I think that a lot of pictures that I've personally seen that are of people about climate change produce this sense of otherness, even though the intention is to create camaraderie and empathy with other people. I think that just in the history of that type of photography, there is a real there's a balance in terms of creating this togetherness, but then there's this dissociation that happens. And the third part is I think that we in the media have enough pictures of polar bears. I'll just say that. I think that there's enough sad polar bears that we have out there. I would ask, to what extent has that motivated people to change or to take action? And I understand the motivating, aspect of this devastating, horrific, sad scene. And I think that there's certainly a place for it to be documented. But if you're the audience and then you see that, and then you want to do something to change things around, change a light bulb or get a hybrid car, what are the limitations of people engaging in that issue? I would say that in some cases and it's not the intention of the outlet or whatever, but there's also almost a sense of shaming or guilting individuals for a systemic issue that is much more complex than one photograph can articulate. So that's my answer.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Kristin, I think the approach that you're taking in Piermont is so interesting in terms of getting creating the space for people to have the conversations with their neighbors. And part of me, when Nathan was describing, and by the way, I'm so sad he isn't here because I had a killer question for him. But I'm just sorry he's not here to share with us his experience as a person in the community. But it seems like, in a way, this process could lead to people feeling even further entrenched in the preservation of their community because their community is so awesome. Like, as he described it, and as you're describing this process, it just seems like this is an indication of a place. This is showing me why I would never want to live anywhere else, right? I would want to live here. So could you just tell us more about how people going through this very sophisticated process of examining their risk and having conversations with their neighbors is leading them to want to leave, unless it's not?
Right, so that's a tricky question. First, thing I'll say is, so we've been working in Piermont for since about 2013, 2014. And I don't know how many people in this room know Klaus Jacob. So he lives in Piermont. So you can imagine Retreat has been on the agenda for a long time among the residents of Piermont. We're not the first people to talk about it with them. So I think they're a little bit unique, certainly among the Hudson Valley communities in that way. And it's hard to separate that history from what we're doing in Piermont. But I will say that some of the things, for example, the hypothetical scenario, the family, the story that we created and put with the real structure in Piermont, those dialogues were very interesting. And right now we've only had those with the neighborhood leaders. We haven't had them with the larger community. But it was interesting to see how quickly, at least the group that I was working with, was like, these people need to leave. They need to get out right now. Like, there is no way they can stay 1 minute longer in this situation. That doesn't make any sense at all. And I was so taken aback because I did not expect that kind of a dramatic reaction. So I think it's something that's on their minds, and giving them the opportunity to talk about it in a safe space with one another helps to strengthen the depth of relationships that they have with one another. And it makes it safe to talk about something that culturally I think we're programmed to try to avoid. And so that, I think, what Susie said about the relationship building, I think is what's really transformative about this process, is that it's strengthening the relationships and providing a safe space to talk about things that normally it's not really acceptable to talk about.
Thank you. Clarisa. What is your superpower? Just kidding, that's not my question. But I did think that was a fantastic way to engage your community. You talked about an approach to journalism that you described as public service. And can you just talk about, I have the assumption when you say that you do public service journalism, that means that you are trying to make a change in the world through your journalism. Can you just say what's different about your approach to journalism and I don't know what you would call the alternative, traditional journalism or something else. How does public service journalism lead to people changing or there being a real difference in the world that you think is different than just sort of the other journalism?
Well, I think a goal I think of public service journalism is that it's not just that you're putting out the story, but that you're kind of completing a loop, a feedback loop. As a journalist, you're doing the interview, you're taking it back, you're writing the story, but then it doesn't really end there. That story somehow goes back to that community or that person that you interviewed. And I think that is kind of the difference of trying to give back to your readership and your audience, and kind of building trust that way, but also kind of allowing kind of connection to happen. So we had to do an in-person workshop so that we could have people meet each other face to face and from different organizations or different professions to meet and talk to each other and just start to foster those relationships or just help kind of work with the community, that we're kind of all doing this together in a way. It's not that I think in terms of storm warnings, I feel like the official source is the National Weather Service, and that is what people should look to. But how we interpret that, then that's a networking of how we talk to one another and connect with one another. And I think that public service journalism plays a role in that connecting.
That's great.
Yeah.
Does it change the story? And can you speak closer to the...
Well, I wrote the story first, and then we did the engagement after. I am really I know different journalists do this differently, but I am very wary that I want to make sure that I'm telling the story correctly of somebody's, especially in the sense of tragedy or something very personal. So I will usually fact check with that a lot. And also, if I'm working with the city, or another organization, I'll be making sure that I have all my facts right before I put it out. And I try to be objective as possible by writing about all of these different perspectives in the story, and I feel like that keeps it objective enough. And then, if we want to do something that's more involved, then that kind of comes after the story is published. So,
great, thank you, Great. Well, let's turn to the audience. I think we'll take three questions at a time so that the panelists can then pick and choose among them. So let me just point. So I've got one here, one in the back in the red, and one right here. And then we'll do another round. So if you could go and then here, and then you guys can pick, okay? Just speak as loudly as you can.
Okay. So I have actually two thoughts. One is, as a former journalist myself, I wonder how much, how the issues with people kind of taking in the information and being willing to talk about managed retreat relates to a lack of trust, not only perpetuated by media scare tactics, but also by the polar bear stories, and then also our current nominal president's refusal to even acknowledge that climate change is real and silencing of the USDA scientists. The other thought that I have is, my beat was agriculture, and the last 2 years that I was working as a journalist, I focused on the relationship between climate change and agriculture, and I learned to call it climate disruption because the scientists I spoke to said change is a natural process, and I started hearing it with the farmers I was speaking to. Well, everything changes. This is what just gave them a sense of comfort that was false. There are farms all over these shoreline communities, and maybe not Piermont, whatever it is, but certainly all over California, all over Massachusetts. There are farms, aquaculture, and also land-based farms, and I'm not hearing really any mention of dealing with farmlands as part of a managed retreat, and that's very disturbing.
Thank you. Because I'm so sorry. I thought that this session went until 3:30, and it doesn't. It goes until 3, which was like 12 minutes ago. So 14 minutes ago. So I'm really sorry, but I need to let everyone go who needs to go. I think because we started a round of questions, we should at least answer one question, right? And if anyone wants to stay and hear a response to the question about agriculture, we'll do that. Apologies. If you want to come and speak with the panelists afterward, I hope some of you can stay for a minute. So does anyone want to take feel free to step out if you need to. Does anyone want to take the agriculture question?
So I just quickly want to speak to the fact that you're absolutely right. We tend to ignore the rural areas in general, which is often farmland. And I think it's particularly challenging because we're not addressing just one level of stress. And quite frankly, that is something we have to realize in every area. Whether you come to an urban, impoverished area that has ongoing stressors that have nothing to do with climate change, or whether you go to a farmland and all the crises in rural areas and farm country. I mean, there are so many things that intersect. I think what we're in for with this, especially in light of the transformative challenges, we actually get to really rethink how do we want to interact with the land, how do we want to interact with each other, and it's deep reckoning that needs to happen. You are not going in to figure out climate change, or you're not going in to figure out just retreat. You're going to figure out livelihoods, values, deep racism, the whole 9 yards. And that is, I think, what we're part of. We're part now of an army of people reckoning with legacies of disastrous behavior, quite frankly. And it's our opportunity to make that right. And but it's a lot more. It's not just one issue at a time. It's these intersecting issues. So thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you. Clarisa, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we'll thank the panel. Go ahead, just speak really close to the microphone.
I'm originally from Kansas, so I know where you're coming from. I see this divide all the time, and we cover New York City, the Metropolitan region specifically, and that issue of relocating to farmland has not come up in any conversations I've had with people that I've met with for stories and stuff, but it is something that I think I'm interested in too, so if you wanted to talk more after, it'd be great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Excited to see an awesome program.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. I feel like I totally love that. When I get really nervous, I black out. So I hope it went have been, like, with my project that I'm working on now, like, figuring out places that I want to spend time in, and definitely Boston is one of them.
Yeah, it's a very interesting area. A lot of segregation and a lot of different history.
You have a card.
I have 2 cards that I brought with me. I would be happy to get.
Okay. But also, if you have them, I can find you online.
That's true.
Okay. So I don't have a card either, so.
Okay. Yeah, I meant to pick them up before I leave, and then I thought I had to go find it.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
No, I teach a kids karate class, so I can handle this. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, people just kind of stopped listening to me when I told them to not sit in the aisles. Yeah, I know. I mean, I think maybe if we can get people into here, but nobody wants to sit. It's like reading time at kindergarten, you know? Yeah. Yeah, around the edges. Yeah. Yeah, but then they can't watch the PowerPoint, so I kind of get that. I don't know. Next, we're doing international comparative perspectives, I think. Yeah, I should have picked all the worst sounding tasks, right? Or maybe now I'm confused. Got switched, right? Okay. Yes. And
Check
I don't
1 2
even know
check
what
check.
to be honest, so. Okay. Sure did.
Just log in.
Oh, sure, yeah, I was just getting you some.
Check 1 2.
They just needed help,
Okay.
like, managing PowerPoints and stuff, which I'm not even very good at, because I don't work with PowerPoint.
Oh, save first, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you gotta. Because I'm like, I'm a writer. Can you just do this in Microsoft Word or Google Docs?
I always have myself to blame because I sent it to her.
I better click on the PIP window.
Say that again? Oh,
Click on it once.
yeah, it's perfect, because I wanted them.
Yeah, he just told me about that.
Are you going out with them?
Number 2, and you should do the closer one.
Yep.
And 3 left.
Yeah.
4.
Yeah,
And that one you can see.
yeah, okay, I fixed it.
Okay, great, welcome. I will get back to you on that and whether you have your
Okay,
PowerPoint.
great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it should be okay. But I'll
Yep.
find you if you have any problems.
And I hear you.
Oh, hi. I'm the captain
Oh, okay, so that's the Zoom. You got to get that going. Everything is working.
So that's okay. Can I go in and look for the PowerPoint?
Yes, you can.
Just to make sure we have everybody. I need to check the folder. So we have. Hopefully, yeah. I think we should get everything set up. If you just want to, if you could do us a favor, can you periodically remind people not to sit on the stairs because they're just constantly streaming in and constantly disregarding my requests. Thank you.
You're presenting?
No, I'm just trying to get these all lined up so that there's transition, hopefully.
Okay. All right, got you. No problem.
One of the most rewarding things I've ever done is that I worked with this network to bring this group of people together around stormwater management, essentially.
Okay.
And
Now, hopefully, everybody.
Decades, literally. And we were able to get them together and talk about this stormwater issue.
Is that a PDF?
A year later, this
Yes.
built on top of
And they're presenting this?
and flooded and all
Maybe that's her. She was misspelled name.
Catherine.
people who were sort of immediately called on to deal with that crisis. And they knew each other, had each other's phone numbers, and had each other's emails. They were like,
Yeah, this is not it. I don't think this is it.
and
It says managing New Zealand. So.
Oh yeah, no, she's from New Zealand, right? Oh, okay,
Yeah, like
right. Okay, maybe.
but we could never have anticipated this crisis that we've been destined to put together and work on.
So it has to be called managing.
Yeah, they're all managers.
Yeah. That might be this one because it's Catherine.
All right, let's go with it. So that one needs to be opened with Adobe, is it? That's what somebody said. I'm learning new things here because I don't normally deal with
this.
PowerPoints or anything. So. Okay. So we have Rob, Rocco, and Catherine. Okay.
They got everything open. Quick question. The person that's actually calling in, is he viewing the panel or are you sharing a document to that person? They can see it?
I wasn't informed about
Okay,
any of this.
okay.
I think they'll probably want to see the room, right?
Yeah, the room, right? Just, would it be like multiple views of, like you can, because it's like multiple views you have too. So I don't know if it's just one view of the whole room or. Yeah, just one view.
I think that's what Haley had mentioned.
Okay, all right.
Anything else?
That's about it.
Are they going to be able to manage the PowerPoint?
That's the only thing. The problem I spoke to Haley about is the person that's calling in knows how to share their document to Zoom. So that would be the only issue if they don't know how to do that. Don't know if they.
Are you?
I'll probably speak with Haley to see if she can get the person to call in prematurely and we can do it.
Well, they've been starting everything like 5 minutes late as it is. So
Okay, so it might
if
be.
they're on time, maybe it will
Work
in
out
our favor.
Exactly. All right. I'll just wait for Haley, I guess. Everything is set up.
Hey, Catherine, can you hear me? Hey, Catherine, can you hear me? Catherine, I don't hear you.
Oh, she's not hearing anything?
Is there a button you have to press to get like the? But sometimes there's a button.
No, it's not me. It's not me.
No, but like literally like changing to get to the speakers.
Oh. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Oh wait a minute. Now I see her thing going up and down.
See the mic?
Well, she was talking and then so the little green thing went up a little bit.
Hey, Catherine, do you hear anything?
So if you're gonna do like a movie here, like to use the whatever the button is, that's all set.
Yeah, everything is set.
But you see, I don't know if you can see her.
Hello?
I just saw her little green mic thing down.
Hello, Catherine, do you hear me? Let me see if it's isolated. Yeah, she's not hearing anything. Nope.
Check 1 2, testing audio 1 2 3. Check 1 2. Check 1 2, testing audio 1 2 3. Check 1 2. So you could type to her saying, "Hey, we just checked our system. Seems that everything is okay." And we used my phone as well. So she's gonna have to go. I can walk her through it. She's gonna try to show me her screen.
International Comparative Perspectives section. Just FYI, we're dealing with a technical issue at the moment, but these two,
That might.
government planning. This is not government planning. Government planning is now next door, 107. This is International Comparative Perspectives. International Comparative Perspectives. Thank you. So we're going to wait just another minute or so while we have one of the presentations. The fourth presentation today is virtual.
I hear her now. Do you hear me? Do you hear me, Catherine? I heard her. seems to come from her end, so she's going to use her phone for the audio.
Seems like you got to clarify this first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to wait another minute or two while the tech connection is made. Well, let me just maybe say a couple of things. My name is Bill Solecki. I'll be the chair for this session. There's actually two sessions formally titled International Comparative Perspectives. There's one now. There's also, of course, one tomorrow. I think one of the things that's very relevant here is that we've already heard lots of different sort of dimensions of this question of sea level rise, the implications for occupancy on the coast. So many of the papers sort of thread. Obviously, there's a strong sort of domestic U.S. kind of focus to some of these discussions based on the nature where this conference is being held. But it's obviously a global question. I think it's going to be a good, these two sessions specifically, looking at some comparative examples from other settings, will be useful for us to sort of reflect back on what we see happening in the U.S. and then, of course, vice versa. So we have 4 presentations. I will give you all the standard sort of comments. So we'll have 4 presentations. As soon as this starts up, we'll go into the first one. Each one will be about 15 minutes in length maximum, maybe shorter. We'll have clarifying questions as needed. And then beyond that, we'll use the remaining time in the session for general discussion, which I think in some ways is some of the most, obviously each presentation is going to be quite interesting, but sort of that kind of free form kind of Q&A process I think is going to be particularly rewarding given the nature of this session. The caveats, I'm supposed to say, now this is a slightly smaller crowd than some of the other, so you're sitting in chairs, but if for some reason you want to sit in the aisle, you're not supposed to. So I'm just saying, right? So don't get out of your chairs and get in the aisles, because that's a fire code thing. I was supposed to say that, right? I'm supposed to say that. Okay. Yeah. Then the other thing for the folks who are presenting, and this is I've kind of highlighted a little bit to some, when you're coming down, put your phone on airplane mode. Otherwise, you start to hear command and control out of the mics. No, you might disrupt the mics. So let me see. I'm going to walk over to here to our tech folks, and we'll see if we can begin. Troubleshooting, a couple of seconds. Okay. Well, have you heard the one now? First of all, maybe, so as we begin, I mean, how many of you, so this is an international perspective, so how many are from outside the U.S. In this? Okay, so it's a good, Europe, how is Europe represented? Anybody? Okay, Europe. Africa, any African scholars, practitioners? Okay, that's a little gap. Asia? Any? Okay. The rest, the Americas, Central, South, Caribbean, etc. Okay, so mostly European. New York, yeah. Well, that's an offshore island. Pacific. I'm sorry. Yes, Pacific. Yes, Australia, of course. All that. You know, I actually teach I'm a geographer. I teach world regional geography, which is actually a very fun class. If you ever have had opportunity to take a class, but it's like. It's the one that sort of changes your perspective more than anything else, because it's like you know around the world in 80 days. So I should have mentioned Oceania and Australia, New Zealand, and all the other kinds of things. Now I'm really struggling for material now. Okay, I think they're reprogramming the building. So, I think we've got a strong-willed candidate here. So, we do have the 4 presentations, and not to sort of hold us up, I've asked James Fitton a big question, the question that we all fear at one point or another. Can we go on without our PowerPoint? And I looked at his eyes, and I asked him that question, and James Fitton from Aalborg University said he's going to try, right? So we're going to get the schedule going. The program's going to begin. I think the tech folks are saying that it should be resolved quickly. So the first presentation, exploring the barriers and opportunities of using managed retreat in Scotland, UK.
Okay, welcome to my presentation. My name is James Fitton. I'm from the Aalborg University in Denmark. But previously moving to Denmark, I was based in Scotland, in Glasgow, and did my PhD there, where I worked very much on modelling of coastal erosion on a national level, using a range of GIS data sets, and later on using a number of historical mapping data sets as well. And my presentation is going to talk about essentially using management retreat in Scotland. We've not really used it at all, really, but it was focusing on, and focuses on more on assets at the coast, not necessarily communities and towns, but actually things like cultural assets and economic assets, in this case in golf courses. Scotland's very well known for its golf courses. In terms of the impacts of climate change in Scotland, there's a range of different hazards, primarily from sea level rise. Predictions from the UK climate change projections for last year predict by 2100 there'll be sea level rise by about approximately a metre across Scotland. And they also produce results or estimates for 2300 as well in those reports as well, where the extreme scenarios are looking at 3.5 to 4 metres of sea level rise by 2300. Obviously, associated with that sea level rise is also an increase in the risk of flooding due to the return periods, and also the increase in storm events that are likely to occur as well. The coastal erosion issue, again, is a big issue which I studied mainly in the PhD. The analysis that we did in the Dynamic Coast project was looking back to 1890 and comparing the position of the coastline then to where it is now. What we found was there's about a 40% increase in the area of erosion across Scotland, and coinciding with that was an increase of erosion rates from about 0.5 metres a year to a metre a year. So a doubling of erosion rates across Scotland was found as well. We have, as I said, 3 examples that I was going to run through in terms of the opportunities and barriers for using coastal retreat in Scotland. The first one being Skara Brae, which is a Neolithic archaeological site up in Orkney, and right at the top of Scotland. This is a World Heritage Site. So it's on par with the Great Pyramids of Giza. It is the Pyramids of Scotland. It was built in 2,500 BC. It was discovered in 1850 by a storm event. It was covered by dunes. And then in 1850 there was a big storm which then uncovered the site, which then led to the archaeologists moving in to actually uncover the site. So there we go.
He's going to go, but you can see what we can do without slides. And, it was great. But anyway, now...
We'll try again. I won't start from the beginning. So that was the sea level rise and the coastal erosion there. And just to nip back in terms of the way Scotland is a country which has very dense coast in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, but it's also very rural. There's lots of places where there's hardly anything happening, essentially. And so in these more rural areas, the traditional cost-benefit analysis that we use to decide whether we actually use any sort of management is often not economic. So we need to come up with more creative solutions within these areas as well. So that's Skara Brae, that's the Neolithic site. As you can see, it is right on the beach, looking out over to the Bay of Scale. I say it's a World Heritage Site and was originally uncovered by a storm in 1850. It is currently now protected by a seawall at the base of the site. So you can see on the left-hand side there is the seawall protecting the buildings, or the Neolithic buildings. But as you can see, at the sides of the seawall there's been erosion. So we're essentially on both sides of the seawall closing in around the site. And the seawall itself, the beach has experienced some lowering as a result of coastal erosion. We're undermining the toe of the seawall as well. So we're creating instability in the seawall. So we've got a number of problems potentially at the site. At the moment, Historic Environment Scotland has monitored the beach, both in terms of the terrestrial laser scanning across the beach, but also the vegetation edge. On the right-hand side there is the retreat of the vegetation edge that's being monitored. And coastal erosion is acknowledged as being a big risk to the site, of course, and they're aware of this, and the options are improving and extending the seawall potentially, and beach recharge, but these obviously all cost money, they're expensive potentially, and we're in a very remote part of Scotland and Ireland. Getting this sort of material to these locations isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. So this is raised the question whether can we move, potentially, is it an option to move a historic cultural asset like Skara Brae back from the coast? By doing that, do we actually destroy the very value of the site itself? Is it then still the original site it was in a new location? Or conversely, are we prepared to actually let this site fall into the sea and assume that we actually don't interfere any further and actually allow that the story of this site is actually to end up being eroded by the sea, as it would have done anyway? So a number of issues there associated with these cultural assets, which aren't necessarily communities, but they actually also bring tourism to the islands and actually build and actually assist the local community as well. So it's not a community, but it's relying upon a community around it. In addition to that case study, we've got the A9 and the Inverness to Wick Railway. As you can see there, the road and the railway meet at the coast at a number of locations and are very, very close to the beach. On the left there, you can see the A9, and on the right there, the railway. And these are the main routes up this part of Scotland, the east coast of Scotland, and they supply a transport route for freight, for people, and it's a key route in this area. The alternative is to go right away to the west coast, and it'll be about an 8 or 9 hour journey to get to Wick if you started down in Inverness. So these are key transport routes in this area. However, they are prone to erosion, certainly, and also flooding. And this is an acute, so short-term impacts, but also chronic and long-term, looking into the future in terms of sea level rise and flooding. However, at this point, there isn't really been a big event that has actually impacted and prevented this traffic or the railway functioning, and therefore it's not necessarily high priority for the people within the region. And there is also a lack of data looking at the indirect impacts of the loss of this road, and therefore the impetus or the motivation to look at alternatives in terms of retreat and rerouting these transport infrastructure has not yet occurred. So this rural aspect of this transport is limiting our management of the area. The third case I want to look at is Machrihanish. That's how you pronounce that word, if you were wondering. Golf courses in Scotland are big business. It's the home of golf. It's where the sport originated. For every £1 that was spent by a golf visitor in Scotland, £5 was spent elsewhere. So hotels, restaurants, transport, etc. So a very big contributor to the Scottish economy. But about 25% of Scottish golf courses are links golf courses, which are coastal golf courses. And about 150 are threatened by coastal flooding and erosion. I'm not a golfer, so to me it only looks like it's grass. Okay? Well, that's all a golf course is grass. But it's actually a very fixed asset. People want to play the holes that they've seen on the TV. They want to play the famous holes at the famous golf courses. And so actually an asset which is grass is actually a very fixed asset, which results in a number of problems, therefore, that they don't want to necessarily move these sites and adjust their golf courses accordingly. However, there's one golf course, Machrihanish Golf Course, which is a relatively new one, which was designed to actually change with the coast. Actually, this is the way golf used to happen. This was the way that golf courses developed, was actually to build a golf course, and then with the coast, with the changing conditions, the holes would change, and therefore you'd get a new golf course over a different period of time. So Machrihanish built this into their plan for the golf course, and they actually have essentially a blueprint how the golf course will develop over time, given the coastal erosion that will occur in the region. And that means there's no need for any sort of defences in terms of hard or soft, or beach recharge, for example, and it also allows the business to actually plan sustainably and plan for the future going forward. And therefore it comes down to some of the barriers that we're experiencing in Scotland. Why is managed retreat or managed realignment not used as much as it necessarily should be when we've got assets which maybe could be movable? We're not talking about necessarily towns for these. But essentially the public and the asset owners are not on board with this approach. It's not necessarily something they consider. Certainly when you think of those golf courses, they are quite determined to keep things fixed where they are. And you can't just necessarily recreate this golf course in a new place because it loses the value of what it used to be. And there's a lot of local importance, a lot of jobs associated with these assets that the local communities rely on, particularly in the rural areas where jobs are few and far between, and they're also experiencing issues such as depopulation and moving to the larger cities. So these assets are key to actually the sustainability and the viability of the more rural communities. And I think ultimately we have to start to consider, are we prepared to actually accept that some of these assets will not be able to be saved? And therefore, what are the indirect consequences, not just beyond are we losing a Skara Brae, but what does that impact have upon the communities that rely on these assets for their livelihoods and their future? Thank you.
Time with the tech stuff. We will, I'm trying to sort of keep it such that we'll have some time at the end to get everyone together, so don't worry if you have more content-rich questions, we'll get to those. But anyway, thank you. And thanks for stepping in with that PowerPoint. Very good. Okay. Next up, we have Ashby Robb from Curtin University and also Western Australia Local Government Association. Is Managed Retreat a reality? Lessons from Western Australia. Great.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get straight into this. Western Australia is the largest state in Australia. It has a coastline of 13,000 miles long. So in comparison, Florida's coast is about 8,000 miles long. And the state of Texas would fit into Western Australia about 4 times. So we're bigger than Texas. But we're not very populated. Just to give you a quick snapshot, the Kimberley region is in the far north. It has a very tropical climate and a very rocky coastline. Then we have the resource-rich Pilbara coast, which is famous for its iron ore exports. We have a lot of holes in the ground. But we have a lot of, it's well known also for its 60,000-year rock art and still a strong presence of Indigenous Australians. The Coral Coast is further south. It's well known for its rich marine environment because we have warm water currents coming down from Indonesia and cold water currents coming up from the Southern Ocean. And in the far south, we have the Great Southern Coastline, and it's well known for its white sandy beaches, its inlets, its fishing towns, and also its rocky granite outcrops, which you can see here. And last of all, we have the Swan Coastal Plain, which is a very low-lying and sandy coastline. It's a relatively new geological landform, and it's also very vulnerable to sea level rise and increasing storm intensities. It also happens to be where most of the state's population live. This is a picture of Perth. Perth is the capital city of Western Australia, and that's the CBD in the far background you can see on the Swan Estuary. Mean sea levels on the Swan Coastal Plain have increased around about 20 centimetres in the last century and 12 centimetres over the last 40 years. So in 2012, the state, not a lot of communities, when I started working with local governments in 2009, not a lot of them were thinking about these risks of sea level rise, despite living on such vulnerable landforms. And then in 2012, the state revised its state coastal planning policy, which is the highest order planning document in the state. And what it did is it required local governments to prepare coastal hazard management plan. Local governments is the closest government to community, but also has the least amount of it doesn't have a lot of access to resources. So this policy also indicated a clear preference for managed retreat over coastal protection, but there's very limited guidance and no funding available on how to achieve managed retreat. So during this time, I attended a lot of conferences. I went along to listen to presentations about how managed retreat and land use planning more broadly is an avenue for achieving, for helping communities prepare for coastal hazards. But I became very frustrated about the lack of detail provided for practitioners. And so what I did in 2014, I started my own PhD on this. And the aim of the PhD was to look at how land use planning instruments can be used to help communities prepare. I used a range of research methods. At the time, I was also helping 5 communities prepare coastal hazard management plans. And I placed a particular focus on Western Australia and the revised coastal policy. So 2 key issues that I wanted to discuss a little bit today with the time remaining that came up in the research were, the first one was, what does a fair and equitable managed retreat program actually look like? The people that I interviewed who are responsible in Western Australia for preparing management plans didn't really have an understanding of what one looked like, and the state wasn't providing much guidance, and the federal government really wasn't doing anything. The other thing that came up in the research continually, and you're probably familiar with this, is in the absence of a managed retreat program, what can local planning authorities do to manage hazards in the interim and limit their legal and financial liabilities? And obviously I'm coming from a strong perspective from working from local government here, so it may come across a little bureaucratic compared to some of the other presentations I've heard today. So a little bit of context before I get into those issues is, in 2017 the state recognised there was an issue, and they released a managed retreat guideline, and that explained to local communities how existing property acquisition laws could be used to extend foreshore reserves inland. But again, they didn't provide any funding for acquisitions. The state government's in quite a lot of debt, despite going through a mining boom of 10 years not long ago. In Australia, we have no national flood insurance program equivalent. So I would suggest that the federal government has not a strong incentive to start investing in property acquisitions compared with the US federal government. And in Western Australia, permanently inundated private land remains in private ownership. We have laws in our state that interfere with common law principles. So back to the first issue, what does fair and equitable managed retreat look like? So the first model I investigated through my research was an early acquisition and leaseback model. This image is of Sydney a couple of years ago, and this is obviously the type of situation we're trying to avoid with early acquisition and leaseback. In Western Australia, we have this model, and it's currently used for creating road and rail infrastructure reserves. There's a few different benefits of this model. Two of these are to purchase property in low property market cycles, and also to provide a direct financial return on public investment, which when you're talking to state governments and you're trying to demonstrate value for money, these are some of the things that get a little bit of traction in Western Australia, at least anyway. So despite the benefits of this program, local governments raised some particular issues that they had with this model in the context of using it for managing coastal hazards. And what they raised was they felt really strongly that property owners who had access to hazard information when they were purchasing property shouldn't be eligible to receive the same amount of compensation as a property owner who did not have access to hazard information when they were purchasing their property or developing their property. The other issue that local government practitioners raised was, for how long can the public afford to purchase private property given sea levels are expected to rise for several centuries? So what sort of precedent are we going to set when we start buying property? So what we came up with is, sorry, I'm just going to get a bit of water here. We came up with an alternative approach, and this is a bare bones model that I'm going to present to you, and you might be able to pull it apart, but we think it's something to work with in preparing a program for managed retreat. So the approach would offer pre-hazard market comparable compensation through voluntary acquisitions to landholders in high-risk areas for a short period following the release of public hazard mapping. The aim of this program would be to acknowledge that there is a legacy of past planning decisions, to reduce the incentive for political, legal and maladaptive action that can arise where landholders are expected to burden the costs of adaptation, and to provide short-term leaseback and public use opportunities. Now, following this compensation period, this approach would start to build risk into property valuations, and the aim of that would be to reflect the increasing risk profile of property, to reflect the increasing availability of hazard information in the market, and also to reflect the opportunity that landholders have to realise assets through either sale, leasing or continued residence. And just on that point, I might just make the point that in Western Australia we have a lot of very wealthy and privileged people own property along the coastline. So this may not work for certain areas, but we think that it probably might work for our state. At the end of the acquisition period, what we think is that lawmakers may have cause to codify common law principles which would ensure public ownership of the fluctuating beach zone. And we think that's very important. And this is just a bit of for those who are a bit more visually inclined, this is a conceptual diagram of how that might work. So importantly, the sliding scale approach we think needs to be guided by some key principles, and these are the principles we think will help guide the approach. And the first one is to improve the communication of risk to the market. I think there's been some really interesting studies out of the US recently, but what we know in Australia is that in 2011 there were some floods in Brisbane, the property prices crashed, and then 5 years later they recovered. So we think that we really need to start improving communication of risk to the market, and we could do that potentially through property valuation. The other principles are there, align with common law, with well-established principles of law, such as contributory negligence and voluntary assumption of risk, and those types of principles help to guide the development of other policy, relieve future decision makers of the expectation to compensate as sea levels continue to rise, and to preserve public ownership of the coastal zone without the continued expenditure of public funds. So the second issue was, what can local government do to manage hazards and limit legal liability? And through the research, I helped to identify a planning framework. And over the last 6 months, 4 local governments have adopted this planning framework, and it's made up of a range of different instruments. First of all, we have a special control area. So this control area helps to ensure that planning authorities actually have discretion to assess new development proposed in hazard areas. There's a lot of exemptions that allow property developers just to apply for a building permit and not go through a planning authority. So that would right that wrong. The notifications on property title to inform current and future landholders that their property is actually located in a hazard area. Limited planning consents, which would allow the continued use of hazard areas, but they would also prevent the permitting of perpetual use rights. And perpetual use rights are one of the key factors of why we're in this sticky situation in the first place. These consents have been applied in other Australian states. They've been successfully challenged by one property owner in one instance. So there's a bit of work to do on those. Assessment criteria, which would clearly indicate to property owners what types of development is appropriate in these areas, and also importantly ensure consistency in the way that planning authorities are assessing development in jurisdictions but also across the state, because there's a lot of interests that start to pick on local government because they deal with property differently in different jurisdictions. Provisions in local planning schemes and management plans to discourage subdivision and rezoning, and also reinforce that public parties aren't responsible for preserving private interests. And I think that that's something that really needs to start to be communicated, because we have a history of building a seawall to protect the community, and there's an expectation there with a lot of landholders. And also lastly, in that framework is reserve funds, which would be a general allocation of property taxes, and they would go towards hazard management activities. So just lastly, in my role with the Western Australian Local Government Association, I help to facilitate quarterly officer forums. And so we bring officers from right across the state who are working to prepare hazard management plans for their communities. We share lessons learned with those officers, and we also explore common issues that need to be resolved. And often we'll bring in someone from a university or somebody from a legal specialist, etc. We look to aggregate resources to fund specialist services. As most people working with local communities know, legal services can be extremely expensive, so we're looking to use the forum to aggregate our resources. And the last two things there, we prepare guidance on where the state is absent or silent in preparing guidance. For whatever reason, they might be hesitant to provide guidance statements, and also advocacy submissions. We recently made a submission to the state on a policy guideline that they just revised, and the state adopted around about 80% of our recommendations, which was a good win for us. So just in summary, is managed retreat in Western Australia a reality? We think it is, with a fair and equitable model, and we think we've got the bones of a model that we can start to work towards. And what can local governments do in the interim, in the absence of a model, or while that's being progressed? And we now have a local planning framework which can help communities limit the risk profile of their areas, and that local governments are adopting. Thank you. No, not really. In Western Australia in particular, we haven't really had many catastrophic events. On the East Coast they have. That image of the swimming pool on the beach, that was one event, and the state government has come into an agreement with the local community to build a seawall to help protect those properties. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Nicolas. I'm a sociologist at IRSTEA, the French Research Institute in Science for Environment. And with my colleague Jeanne, economist at the same institute, we will share some insights on the politics of managed retreat as it appears currently in the French institutional landscape. A term usually used in France being much more relocation. I will start by talking about how the issue of managed retreat arrived on the political agenda. Then I will report on a call for projects to illustrate the politicization process of managed retreat in France for the last years. And after that, Jeanne will focus more on the individual preferences of residents relating to managed retreat. So just a few words about the general context of coastal dynamics. Mainland France has 5,500 kilometers of coastal areas, and a quarter is affected by erosion. It is one of the most sensitive countries to coastal erosion in Europe, and there is about 8 million people living in these areas, and here are some estimates of people exposed to coastal erosion and flooding. The population of French coastal areas grew by over 40% between 1961 and 2010, and at the same time, coastal areas lost over 20 square miles to erosion. And vulnerability is still increasing, as the population of these areas is projected to grow by 1.4 million between now and 2040. These figures also need to be placed in their political context, because French policymaking is organized very differently from the American system, for example. National government plays a much more important role, while responsibilities are devolved to municipalities or groups of municipalities. There is a continual backloop to the federal administration. France has also an insurance system for dealing with natural disasters, such as severe flooding. The system is funded at national level through a levy on home and car insurance policies. It uses a principle of national solidarity, meaning that everybody pays the same percentage regardless of where they live. So let me explain how governance of coastal adaptation works in France, and before focusing on managed retreat. We can consider three main dynamics that process together. The first is the introduction of stronger prevention measures to deal with rising sea levels. This includes new water level scenarios in risk prevention modeling and coastal prevention plans, and especially since Storm Xynthia in 2010. The second dynamic refers to what I call public action strategies that operate at different scales. Here you can see the two main national strategies, one dealing with coastal erosion and the other dealing with river and coastal flooding. I would just mention that there is a lack of coordination between them because these two strategies are not managed within the same government department. The third dynamic is an incentive-based process for preparedness and resilience building, particularly through experiments and call for projects. Managed retreat mainly appears in this political process, as we will see just now. Indeed, the notion of managed retreat first appeared in French official texts around 1990. In 1998, a French parliamentary report identifying the main obstacle to managed retreat as being a social one, stating that, I quote, "The method is unpopular in a country where the defense of private property is of great importance." The first research into managed retreat happened in the early 2000s. However, there have been a handful of attempts to implement it in practice, notably the relocation of a road in the Mediterranean, the removal of houses on a cliff edge in the north of France, and a few other examples. For the moment, there is no example of managed large-scale retreat. The key moment was around 2009-10, when the Marine and Coastal Summit, the Grenelle de la Mer, highlighted the need to, I quote, "engage in robust discourse about coastal management and facilitate the acceptability of measures such as managed retreat." This was followed by Storm Xynthia in 2010, which raised awareness of coastal vulnerability. It was one of the biggest flooding disasters in many years in France, claiming 47 lives and costing around 1.5 billion euros in damage. In the wake of these events, a national working group was set up to develop the national strategy for integrated coastline management. In 2012, as part of this strategy, the French Environment Ministry launched a call for proposals entitled Experimenting with Managed Retreat in At-Risk Coastal Areas. The call for proposals was sent out to local councils, asking for volunteers to take part in a simulated implementation of managed retreat. The aim was to help draft national guidelines for policymakers relating to technical, legal, financial, and economic levers and tracks of action. There were only 5 responses to the call for proposals, and all selected by a national board. The projects aim to simulate future managed retreat programs and see how successful they could be under current legislation. This was achieved through scenarios and feasibility studies, as well as participatory approach. Here you can see 4 scenarios constructed for the town of Lacanau on the French Atlantic coast. 3 of them involved managed retreat, while the one on the top left shows a hold-the-line approach. No decision has yet been taken by the municipality about which approach to adopt. However, they have taken a number of no-regret actions, and let's look at the reasons behind this situation. Mainly speaking, experimentation has provided 3 main lessons. Because the financial cost of relocating huge numbers of homes and businesses is too great for a single municipality to bear, there is a need for other organizations to help support and organize this operation, and to help interaction between political and environmental programs at different scales. The experimentation also shows a form of government which involves local authorities in potentially risky reforms without imposing new rules and hard laws. In this sense, it can be viewed both as a policy instrument and as an innovation process. And it did. The experiment created some meaningful developments and learning processes, especially when elected officials were involved, and where boundary organizations between science and politics also played a key role. Some of the lessons learned formed part of a proposed law. But as we will see, despite the outcomes of the projects, there are still legal, financial, and political barriers to achieving managed retreat. So this new law aimed to create new planning, regulatory, and financial instruments to deal with the temporality of risk. This included new zoning mechanisms, as well as a system to expropriate property but let people stay in their homes until actual demolition and relocation. However, this law was never enacted before the 2017 presidential election. Since then, it has been subject to varying levels of interest within the government and the parliament. And one of the latest examples of this was only a few days ago, as you can see here in this bill, and we will come back to this bill in the conclusion.
So while this policy is going on in the background, there is still a very real issue of how best to involve local communities and residents in managed retreat. So what about individual preferences? So here are some insights from a choice experiment. Choice experiment is an economic valuation method. It's an economic stated preference approach that should provide guidance, some support in development and planning decisions, particularly when dealing with rising sea levels. The main objective is to identify inhabitants' preferences for an hypothetical managed retreat strategy. So preferences are measured through an indicator that we call a willingness to pay. We have developed a choice experiment survey in the southeast of France, in a coastal area. We use 240 respondents' responses, and the sample that we have constituted is spatially balanced between coast and hinterland in order to have to take information about territorial solidarity and distance decay willingness to pay. The approach of choice experiment involves presenting different hypothetical scenarios to survey respondents and asking them to choose the scenario they prefer. Each scenario illustrates a different hypothetical relocation strategy. And each scenario is constructed on the base of the following attributes. There is 4 attributes: consultation, timing, schedule, and additional cost. Consultation reflects the extent to which inhabitants are involved, and it can be no consultation at all. It can be a consultation regarding the zones to be relocated, and it can be a consultation on the compensation criteria for relocation. The timing consists in the implementation period, and it could be in short, medium, or long term. The policy implementation schedule could be in successive stages or as a one-off. And to finish, the additional cost is what we call the monetary attribute, and is defined as the financial contribution that households would have to pay if the strategy is no more hypothetical, but is taken. So people had to choose between 2 different scenarios or alternatives and what we call a reference situation. This reference situation is the current situation, and in our case, it's the protection strategy through beach nourishment. So such a situation, reference situation, is associated with no additional cost, of course, because it's the current situation. So once the data collected, we use a discrete choice modeling in order to explore and to estimate people preferences for the different relocation attributes. Here are the main results. To summarize, we can say that preferences for relocations are heterogeneous, and mainly they can be structured between 2 main groups or class of preferences. The first class, in the first class, people prefer consultation regarding the compensation criteria. They want a strategy that would be implemented in the midterm and step by step, and they prefer low cost within small area. The second class prefer a consultation regarding the size of the area to be relocated. They want a strategy to be implemented now and step by step, but they agree for a higher cost and over a larger zone. We have looked at the main variables that explain these different preferences, and mainly they are influenced by risk perception. For the first class, the first class is explained by the dwelling property located in flood-prone areas, and by the fact that people do not feel concerned. They feel not to be exposed to risks, what we call an optimism bias. The second class is more explained by recollection of violent storms, people remember, and greater awareness of flood risks. The first class agree around the idea, the concept of individual responsibility, whereas the second class is more engaged on the idea of solidarity, territorial solidarity. To conclude, I would say that in France there is a growing awareness at different levels concerning coastal vulnerabilities and increased... what's that? And an increased willingness to build a managed retreat framework. But an institutional shift is needed. A recent report and the new law proposal have provided some recommendations or some guidelines in order to implement managed retreat strategy. Here are 3 of the advances that have been proposed: a tax increase on property transactions that may be put towards a new fund dedicated to a specific restructuring of coastal areas. We also have a measure about making the state, the federal institution for us, state funding conditional on the adoption of coastline management strategy by local authorities. And we also have new legal instruments that should be defined, such as resilient zoning or property rights. But it raises some key issues related to solidarity or also responsibility and justice. So we have to to take into account these two key issues, particularly when in research, when we are social scientists, but also in decision making. Thank you very much.
Yes, I wanted to ask, in your research, you had the modes around which you ask questions, and then you divided, and based on responses, is that how you created Class 1 and Class 2? Yeah. Those weren't two separate regional groups that then responded. You created those based on the survey responses?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, could you just repeat?
Sure. There were 4 components to the...
Yeah? 4 attributes, yeah.
3 alternatives for the first and 2 for the second.
No. No, we used the 4 attributes and their different levels. We mixed all them together to create numerous scenarios or alternatives. And we present to each respondent the same scenarios, and they had to do 4 choices. So they had they faced 4 what we call choice card or choice experience with 2 scenarios and the reference scenarios.
Thank you. And so, thanks very much. Thank you. So I think we're going to try to bring in, we're going back out to Oceania, to New Zealand.
Yeah, she's calling in, yeah.
Okay. So our 4th presenters, and thank you. Hopefully this will work. We're going to go to New Zealand, but then we'll get everyone back up at the panel discussion to follow. So the 4th presentation, Managed Retreat in New Zealand, Catherine McGilly-Banks, Victoria University of Wellington, virtual. Let's see. Survey says. There before. As this is coming on, maybe I had a quick question for the recent papers. Maybe you guys would respond in your seats. So what is sort of, obviously very different, papers, very different perspectives. Can you sort of crystallize on what is sort of driving some of these issues? I mean, the issue of managed retreat, they came from different places. Obviously, the issue of sea level rise, but was there, beyond that, is there specific sort of national issues or national initiatives or a particular large storm, or what sort of catalyzed your studies? Obviously in the U.S. context, we've talked about some large storms and some other sort of local initiatives, but it seems, I know internationally, there's a variety of factors that get things going. I don't know if you wanted to speak just for a moment while we get this going.
Yep. One of the key drivers really that sort of pushed coastal management in general, coastal adaptation, is what happened in England in 2014. A big storm event and a big section of rail track was damaged and lost to the sea, and there's about a 3-month period of repair work taking place on that. And essentially the government in Scotland saw what happened in England and just thought, well, we need to make sure that doesn't happen here. And that really was the sort of starter to get things moving in Scotland, is actually seeing something near.
Yeah, two things that come to mind. 80% of Western Australia's population lives within about 8 miles of the coastline. So we have a very, very strong attachment to the beach culture and using beaches and having public beach access. So, and in conjunction with the state policy revision was I think one of the IPCC reports that came out in 2011, and the state revised its sea level rise benchmark from 30 centimetres to 2100 to 0.9 or nearly a metre of sea level rise to 2100. So to preserve public beach access, I think the state just saw that public expenditure on seawalls and things like that was going to really interfere with how Western Australians use the beach. Yeah.
Not an initiating event, but sort of just
Yeah, yeah.
And how about for France, sort of initiating event,
Yeah, I just would say that it was around 2009-10, as I mentioned, with the Grenelle de la Mer, the French Coastal and Marine Summit, in which managed retreat was on the high top of the national agenda. And just after that, Storm Xynthia in 2010, so it's a conjunction of factors. And just one more element, it's about the key role of what I call boundary organization at regional scale, and essentially in New Aquitaine region on the southwest, on the Atlantic coast. There is a public interest group called the GIP, Public Interest Group of Aquitaine Coastline, and which is very active on this on this subject because of the exposure to coastal erosion. So it's.
Oh, I can hear you this time. Wow. Brilliant. I realized just as I was getting this up that I didn't actually send you the PowerPoint because I was typing notes in case that's all you had. So, barely, but yes. That might be my fault because it was echoing before and I turned it down. Oh no, I'm up max. So,
maybe you can hear me better now?
Yes,
Okay.
completely.
Wow. I feel
What a
like
difference.
like some telethon. Okay, so you're speaking us from New Zealand.
Yep.
What time is it? Sometime tomorrow morning, or tomorrow evening, or something like that.
Friday morning, 8:30 a.m.
Okay,
Yeah,
very good.
that's
Okay,
fine.
excellent. So we've worked very dynamically to get you going. So what is the next step? Assistance here?
So actually I realized the difficulty because I've been switching computers for this. The PowerPoint's on my other computer. So I was going to email it to Hayley and then got distracted when she said, oh no, that'll fine. You'll be at the end of the session.
Catherine, we have a PDF from, I don't know if you sent it yesterday. It might be slightly outdated. Should we just go with that?
I guess unless I send it, unless I just send it right now.
Okay, but I think you'll see it on the screen, I believe, if you can see us. So therefore, when we bring it up, you'll be able to say next, that kind of thing, as cryptic as that sounds.
Exactly.
You can actually share it on Zoom. If you would like to display it, you could just hit the share button.
Yeah, that's the difficulty. It's because it's on a different computer because of the sound and the. Sorry, that's why I'm looking sideways. One's on laptop, one's on desktop. I've sent it to Hayley. Okay. So maybe I should start. So Hayley will, as long as it, and I can actually, I might be able to bring it. Sorry for this. When she said it'll be at the end, and I was just thinking, all right, that'll be like another hour or more away. Sent.
So, Catherine, can
Okay,
you see the
I'm
screen?
going to open.
Can you see it? It says the changing landscape.
I did. There was a poster that went up. Yes, so that poster was from a survey. So you've got in my abstract that I have.
Okay. So it's not the full presentation.
Now, can you see that? Can you see my screen? The one that says managed retreat issues in New Zealand?
No, not yet.
Okay. because maybe that's, okay, because I do have, so
well, Catherine, we're going to have a nice arc of the session, if I could ask. Our first speaker had a problem with some of the technical issues, and he gallantly spoke from memory. Now that you've got it...
Yeah, exactly. I can do that, but I just thought if you could see my pictures and all the bullet points, but that's fine. I will just talk.
Especially given the murkiness of New York at the moment, but New Zealand would be nice. But
okay, so maybe I can just talk and not worry about the PowerPoint at all. You've actually got a number of speakers from New Zealand at your conference, I gather, and so we've got. I won't do all of the details, and I'll adjust myself. I won't do all of the details. I thought I'd start with the more general one, with the population of. New Zealand's about the same size as the UK and Italy. So, but instead of 60 or 65 million people, we've got about 5 million. So the same size as these countries with like less than a tenth of the population. Yet we have the ninth largest coastline with a tiny population of 5 million. But most of our towns and cities are along that coast, and all of our large ones. So we have a huge liability for sea level, liability for a lot of damage, but people and property. But also nature. That's one of the things that has not been looked at a lot in terms of what the effect will be on wildlife, things like that. So I'm ignoring that. We're just looking at the managed retreat, for people and buildings. But our legal framework, we have a unitary legal framework. So with one state, not one federal state, but we don't have divisions into regular states. So it's easy to pass laws. It's much more easy to pass laws to fix problems if we have them. Yet we still haven't done it. We have some overarching resource management laws and a coastal policy statement from the government that's it's guidance. It's more than recommendations in some respects, but they do actually say in our coastal policy statement that local governments which have so it's local governments, not central government, that has responsibility for most of the decisions in this area at the moment under sort of existing frameworks that don't really cater for managed retreat. But they do say in the guidelines that the government that decisions have to consider managed retreat, including other options and defences. But it's in there as a list, but it's not mandatory, and there's not actually proper legal frameworks for doing it. Now, I have sent the PowerPoints to Hayley so she can make them available separately afterwards. So the next slide is one on the Treaty of Waitangi. We do have similar with the USA. We have Indigenous peoples that were here before the Western settlers, and we have one treaty, not lots of treaties. We have one treaty that was taken around all the tribes, and that still affects and has moved in some of the duties in those treaty, the duties for the protections for the local Maori, for protection of, we call them taonga, their lands, forests, fisheries, estates, and their governance of those protections in the treaty are a central government responsibility. So that is like your system with federal responsibility for tribes. And so in that sense, our local governments that have responsibility for managed retreat don't have direct treaty duties. They're considered delegated authorities, but if they undertake actions that might breach a treaty duty, then it's central government that has that responsibility. Again, so that's very similar to in the USA. And where the government has, where that plays out is it's at a central government level. So the government could be taken to the tribunal for that. So a tribunal, a grievance settlement tribunal. So again, I'm just putting that in as a background factor for some of the laws that deal with this area of managed retreat. I'm part of a project that not transgender lawyer project, I can see, but part of a project with our Deep South National Science Challenge. Sorry, I've been distracted, as you can see, and I've got a monkey kitten climbing all over my computer. Part of a Deep South National Science Challenge for New Zealand that is looking into climate adaptation issues. We've provided 4 reports as just my little piece of the challenge, and I know some of the other people there are looking, from New Zealand, are looking at other pieces of the challenge puzzle. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of our reports, and again, what I had up on the screen. Our first one was a set of case studies on insurance and compensation after natural disasters. And that really looked at comparative issues, the UK and the USA flood insurance schemes, and some New Zealand and Australian examples for comparison. I guess key lessons, really, they're kind of obvious, but at least, I mean, there are lessons about how to design a flood protection scheme as an example, but the biggest lesson is that any residents hit by any natural disaster clamour for relief, even if they were not prepared despite warnings. Politicians usually give in, and it's a self-reinforcing circle. Some schemes are more effective than others at preventing future losses and liabilities, but that's really, I guess, all I'll summarise by that. But there are lots of lessons for how you might want to go forward if you could get round to designing such a scheme. Our second report was on our national earthquake insurance scheme. It was earthquake and natural disasters. We call it our EQC, Earthquake Coverage, Earthquake Commission scheme. But natural disaster insurance is provided, but it's just an add-on to private insurance where the government takes a small proportion of liability as a minimum amount that's guaranteed, so then you're more likely to have private insurance cover. Because the private insurance doesn't take all of the risk. So it's almost, people have looked at it almost as an insurance maintenance scheme, as in a private insurance maintenance scheme, so we don't get insurance retreat quite so quickly. Sea level rise is not an insurable event, but it does play into the other covered events, storms, flooding, and landslips. But unfortunately, it's not going to be able to be used for managed retreat, and various reasons, but that's the one takeaway. We have a national insurance scheme, right, a government-provided one, that still cannot be used for managed retreat, even though it could be used for other measures, not in advance. So I won't go into the nuances and details, but that's one of the takeaways of our second report that's relevant to managed retreat. The third one is our largest one, and it looks at local government liability issues. And there is a section on managed retreat in this, and we've also got the New Zealander, Ben France Hudson, who's talking about this in more detail later in your conference. I guess the first step for managed retreat is usually to indicate the future hazards, such as inundation lines that might want to be placed on titles or on council maps of an area. And we've had cases, we've had attempts by councils in New Zealand to introduce such hazard lines, and we've had one taken to court, and the council lost because they didn't do it right. So it's made all other councils really hesitant to do anything in this area. But the Environment Court in New Zealand has said that as soon as a threat has risen above mere speculation and was a reasonable possibility, and that's the quotes, reasonable possibility, then a council needs to inform all affected parties, such as doing it via hazard lines. So in that sense, the council was right. They had to do something, and they could theoretically be sued later if they hadn't indicated, as soon as they know that, that there is likely to be, say, significant erosion and damage and threats to housing and businesses in an area, from sea level rise. However, they need to do it in the right way, right? Science needs to be accurate, right? It couldn't be so general, like not take into account particularities of a place. In this case, the residents that took the case where their particular property had had a hazard line struck right through it, yet at that particular end of the beach was subject to accretion, not erosion. And so the council said, yes, those hazard lines were not explained properly. It made it look like that property was going to disappear, and that was not good enough. So the science needs to be accurate, and it needs to be explained clearly enough for people, you know, if it's on titles or if it's on council planning documents, you need to put it, you need to explain it in the right way so people can understand what the nuances are, where the bounds of error are, and what the likelihood is in the next 50 to 100 years. So we have had that go to court. Unfortunately, managed retreat is treated in itself, has been approached in many different ways by different councils because the law is an enabler of, in some respects, but it's a disabler in many others for managed retreat. We have a lot of existing property rights that councils are saying they don't think they can do anything in relation to retreat. So we've had some councils say, we're not doing anything. We hold our hands up, we wash our hands. It's not us that's taking your property, it's the sea.
Catherine?
At the moment, they're not. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. So I was going to flag something, but you couldn't see me. So I'm going to tell you just a couple more minutes, and then we're going to bring you and then the rest of the panel back on. So maybe about 3 minutes or so, and then to sort of summarize, and then we could. I apologize for all the tech stuff, but we've got you face to face, so that's 95% of what we needed. Okay, so maybe a couple more minutes, and then we'll get everyone back together with you.
That's fine. So that was, so these various different approaches we've had, you know, some councils saying we're not doing anything and we're not going to do anything, you can't make us, we have no money to do anything, there's no point putting up seawalls, we're just going to let the sea take you home. And others are, we have maybe at the other end of the spectrum, a community-managed decision-making process, which I understand is going to be explained further at your conference by another New Zealander. And they've gone through they've decided on a process of staged retreat and with trigger points for when things will happen in the future. What sea level rise points, for example, will particular actions, adaptation actions happen, and one of them will be retreat. And the community has agreed on that. Other ones, the council has tried to impose it without community agreement, and there's been a little bit of a fuss about that. And everywhere, communities are saying, or they generally, most communities can see the need for retreat and they're happy to do it, but they just don't want to pay for it. Nobody wants to pay for it, and that's where the law is coming in. So I guess my last two aspects to talk about is the Treaty of Waitangi duties, the Māori duties. In there we've got quite a few case studies where local councils in their decision making are not taking into account their effects, what the effects of the decisions will be on Māori interests, and they may be treaty guarantees. So the councils themselves, at the moment under current law, won't be liable for any mistakes they make there, but the central government will in the future. So that's just an issue for central government and their decision making and whether they're going to change the processes or the rules around decision making for local governments in this area, because otherwise central government will have difficulties in the future. And then the final thing that we've done in our project, so you could say it's the fifth aspect, is a survey. We did a survey of local government. We actually got a more than 50% response rate of all of the, I think it was a 66 response rate of the councils that agreed, that have got coastlines. And that we'd identified as relevant. And so that's actually a very large proportion. Their takeaway is that basically, which is interesting, how they had a question of how well prepared are they over the next 10 years. And this is councils who've done nearly no adaptation or decision-making processes in the area, yet only 37% thought they were underprepared. They thought they were doing fine. So we thought that was an interesting mismatch in terms of what the scientists and others think need to be done and what some of the decision makers need to be done. But of those there's lots of reasons for those who are not prepared, for thinking they're not prepared, and only 45% have considered managed retreat, very low given the affected areas. But 75 and 76% expected and wanted central government, both expected, one wanted, those different numbers, central government to become involved. And the only thing that is not all bad, there's lots of results that are a little bit, I wouldn't say depressing, it's a bit extreme, but they're not very advanced in terms of the decision making in this area. But we have had central government guidance released just a year and a half ago, and councils are already finding that extremely useful, and they're starting to bring that the central government guidance on how to make climate adaptation decisions, including on managed retreat. Well, actually, there isn't a lot of guidance on managed retreat, but they're finding it generally helpful. So, and councils are being able to hold that up almost as a shield, if not as a sword, as a defense mechanism to say, yeah, we can make these decisions, we have the authority, and this is how we should be making them, so you can't take us to court for negligence in one, making these decisions in the first place, or two, making them badly when we've got an actual standard here for how they should be made. So I'd say that's the best guidance in the best takeaway from all of our government workers, work on liability, is that councils have been too scared to make decisions in the absence of a clear decision-making framework and standards. We've had now 20 cases, just one today, of actually an opposition minister who's taken the Nelson Council to court over landslip protection works, or not doing them. And we've had more than 20 cases in the Environment Court about these issues, and a lot of them, there's just no standards, and the court's having to make it up as they go. With standards, one, there'll be fewer court cases and there'll be more decision-making. And I think I've taken my 3 minutes up there, so I know I should stop. I've got a lot more, I've got a lot of slides that I'll just send through, and I'm happy to have people, to let people have them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we will have those sent out to folks. So thank you so much, Catherine. I know it's been a challenge. Of course, that just shows that we can solve some of these extreme event managed retreat issues if we can get all of the world in a room, and we sort of kind of did. So can I ask the other presenters to come up? And then we do have a few 10-plus minutes or so for some questions. What I'd like to do is just to ask the audience to, I'll take 3 questions, and then we'll let the folks sort of respond in kind. Catherine, you're with your fellow presenters here now, so it's finally we're all together. Good. So comments, questions, considerations. I know we had a couple of sort of follow-ups immediately, but anything come to mind? I will ask one question just to sort of gin the process a little bit. I mean, Catherine, you spoke of it. I think, James, you spoke of it as well. And this is something that I see sort of bubbling up. I mean, a lot of the discussion, obviously, in the meeting so far has been on individuals or on communities and questions of decision-making and so forth. But then there's another sort of scale. We're talking about sort of deep cultural, historical sort of elements of society, and even the issue of Western Australia and the connection to the coast. So I guess, how, just a question out to the panel, how are your respective countries dealing with this sort of, not just particular homeowners, not just particular communities, but sort of iconographic elements, even the ancient paleo, not the paleo, but the what's that? Neolithic. Sorry, thank you. My parents are archaeologists, I should know. But anyway, but yeah, so how do you deal with these kinds of questions in the question of managed retreat and sea level rise loss? I don't know.
I think it's, at the moment, it's not explicitly discussed in terms of climate change and managed retreat or coastal management regards a specific Skara Brae, for example. I think it's more looking at the viability of the communities in general that sort of rely on those areas. And as I mentioned, these places are generally rural communities where there's depopulation, there's loss of fishing industry, for example, and so they're looking to be sustainable communities in general, not just from a coastal point of view. And I think it's obviously about managing these assets like Skara Brae, but being aware that there's a lot of indirect connections that rely on these sorts of assets.
But even like the idea of the golf courses as part of sort of the iconographic imagery of northern Scotland and all this other kind of stuff. So I don't know if anybody else wants to, maybe a question, and why don't we take a few questions, and then we'll sort of start a conversation with you, and then Ben. Yeah.
Thank you. So there was an interesting panel this morning about environmental justice, and that's a big theme in the U.S. when it comes to climate change. And I wonder if you can each, if you've seen some of these themes emerge in each of your countries, in each of your settings, though I understand that's not the focus of your research. And when it came to France, you mentioned that solidarity and climate justice emerged as lessons. And so, how did they?
My sound just got cut off. Whatever was pushed there.
Well, we can hear you.
Sorry.
How did that emerge? And can you also just kind of translate the idea of solidarity, which I think is not something that in the American setting is something we understand. Like, how is it an issue? What does it mean?
So before you respond, maybe Ben, you want to ask your question real quick, and then we'll open it up.
So I'll use the microphone, and I hope you can hear me over there in New Zealand. So I'll attempt to link together this question about justice, iconography, and the state. So here goes, that forms of action, possibly what we're seeing in these four cases, are that forms of action are constrained by longstanding relations of central governments, local governments, types of responsibilities. And that's building on Bill's question about events that promoted things. In a sense, some of the events were natural hazards, but there also was a government law in France that was kind of an event of itself, and there was an IPCC report that was an event in Australia. So the thought would be that governments have ongoing responsibilities to citizens, and it's through that responsibility that equity comes forward, that equity could be for regions in the center in France, that equity could be the indigenous people, the Maori and the Pākehā in New Zealand, that could be the fairness to all ordinary Australians who have the right to the barbecue and the beach, so that these would be state-local relations that are governed perhaps by understandings of citizenship, which then allow equity to be visible in different forms.
Great question. But I'm going to do one more tech intervention. Catherine, when you're not speaking, could we ask you to move your mic away from your mouth? We're hearing every breath. It's all good.
Sorry. But just before I did, can I just then answer?
Absolutely. But just say when you're not speaking, just stretch it up to the head or something.
Then I'll turn it away. Sorry, didn't even think of that. So the environmental justice is actually my key area of research. I added this one on climate adaptation. I added to it. So of the four reports, the one I've actually enjoyed the most is the one on Treaty of Waitangi duties to Māori. And again, I guess if there's one takeaway, it would be equality is not equity. And so when there's treaty duties, just as an illustration, we've had one some Māori wanted protection for their particular property. They actually asked for a seawall for Māori freehold land in one rural community. The council said, no, we've got the same duties to you as other landowners. You don't get a seawall under the criteria, right? Yet we have a separate High Court and Environment Court rulings say that, and legislation actually about Māori land that says it's not equal to other land. It has different rules, and particularly in light of historical dispossession, that there's actually more of a duty to protect that land. So it's often arisen not in sea level rise cases, but it's arisen in, for example, taking of a road for national importance reasons, under the Public Works Act, taking a piece of Māori land to build a road over it. And the Environment Court says, no, actually, you need to consider other options first. This land has an historical importance that we need to keep. We can apply the same reasoning to sea level rise, and perhaps there's more duties to protect land that Māori have historical and cultural connection over. And that we should be thinking of that more in line with our decision making. So we need to bring that more to the fore. I've got lots of case studies of where it hasn't been done, but I do think that that's a huge issue. And in America, the law, federal Indian law, is just pathetic on protecting historical Indian sites, and needs to do a lot more. And it will continue to be pathetic if something's not done in relation to managed retreat as well.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to our French colleagues. There was a couple of questions that were directed toward you, and then maybe if we have time, bring others into the conversation.
Maybe regarding the solidarity issue, I think that in France, actually, we are in science and decision making are both thinking about a way to create the solidarity framework to finance managed retreat or spatial restructuring of territory. And particularly the solidarity, the territorial solidarity I talked about, is mainly based on the use values that people have. They give to the coast and to the coast.
We have to be flexible in the face of challenge.
Yeah, does it work? So some people do not live on the coast, but they are used to go to the beach. They go surfing, they go swimming, and they agree to finance protection for the beach and for the coastline. Some other people are living on the coast, and they are sometimes, and it's our results, they are less willing, they have a willingness to pay lower than the other, because they do not feel concerned about the risk, and they do not understand why they should pay even to go out of their place. So that's that's the thing. We are trying to understand how to manage these particular different positions of people regarding the coastline.
Great. So I think Ashby has a follow-up to that as well, and then maybe we'll close up the session.
Just to comment on that, I alluded to it in my presentation. I skipped over it pretty quickly because you could spend a lot of time discussing it. But in Western Australia, I mentioned that we have statutory laws that interfere with the common law principle of doctrine of accretion and erosion, and some people call it a little bit differently. But that's interfered with by the definition of Crown lands in our Land Administration Act. And that definition was introduced to ensure private ownership and responsibility over canal estates, so over permanently inundated private land. But what it's done is it's potentially going to have a significant impact on permanently inundated private lands where they're interfering with public beach access. So my point, I guess, is that governments can make laws with good intentions, but they can have repercussions in other instances. And in this one, traditional uses.
Great. I know there's probably other questions, but I think there is also, starting up just in a moment, an undercurrents navigating the human dynamics of climate migration and applied theater approach. So that's actually going to begin next door momentarily. But again, so I want to maybe close this session down. We've looked at some of these international dimensions. I think it's a great opportunity for us to sort of reflect, obviously in New York, but with a lot of perspective on the U.S., but to look internationally and then to use that as a reference and mirror back onto what we're thinking about, as well as, Catherine, you just mentioned some of the issues that we have to reconcile in the United States. So again, there's another session on international comparative dimensions tomorrow as well as sort of, throughout many of the sessions. So I think this is obviously a global issue, and it adds to the richness of the conversation to get all these perspectives. So thanks to the audience, thanks of course to the panelists and you, Catherine, and the tech person. So enjoy the evening. There is an event now at 5, and there's also another film presentation at 6, so activities continue. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we might take you offline, but you also shared your PowerPoint.
Permanently inundated yet?
It remains private. It doesn't interfere with access to it.
Yeah, it's kind of, I heard it.
Like a beach, essentially.
Yeah, I heard it.
Yeah, so there is permanently inundated land now.
Yeah, I've seen it's a lot of problems. We had a problem with
interfered with public beach access. Because
this room.
There's not a lot of pressure on that area, on that block of land, and it also really only becomes a pressure when the private landowners
Hopefully.
people coming across there.
This was so...
an interesting case.
Oh, so you were dealing with the same problem prior?
Wales, if you're interested in reading it.
Yeah.
That's
crazy.
It's referred to in my paper, but I can actually send it to you, Sebastian, if you like. It was in New South Wales, and in New South Wales...
I mean, I think the problem also, that's why I came here like a half an hour.
Which is like a high court.
I guess they went over their time, so it's going to give us like 30 minutes to actually...
It's not, I can't set precedent, but it is setting, it's helping to develop policy, or it's actually...
Oh, yeah, so,
I mean, don't quote me on this one, but
No.
I've had someone in New South Wales...
Yeah, that was what he did.
In the New South Wales
And you didn't have the document, or it was like just like a...
Officers tell me that because the Land Environment Court there has used that decision, or because that decision has, or the court's made that decision.
Yeah, of course, he left us with his, I guess.
The court's decision where there's an argument. So, the decision was that that person's land, the high water...
Anybody else coming in, or just... He said leave him on for some reason, so I don't...
The high water mark, basically. So where, and the New South Wales government...
Yeah, I thought the same thing, but...
Where they're having...
My voice is kind of deep and loud anyway, so...
Where they're having private property owners start to have problems with people coming onto what they think is their property. These government officials...